Hi guys. Tonight, we step into a time long past a time when the winter nights stretched endlessly before those who dared to live in the wilderness. The air was sharp with the bite of cold, and each breath seemed to freeze in the lungs. Imagine trudging through snow, the ground crunching beneath your feet, as the world turns a deep shade of icy blue. The wind howls, a constant reminder that nature holds no mercy. It's a different world from the warmth and comfort we're used to. A world where survival, day by day, was a feat of resilience, where every night felt like a battle against the elements. The cold would creep in, no matter how you tried to fight it. It was relentless. You probably won't survive this. No, seriously. Just thinking about living through those winters, how could anyone? But the people of the medieval wilderness did. They had no choice. The harshness of winter wasn't something they could avoid. It was simply part of the life they lived. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Share your location in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like to sleep through a medieval winter in the wilderness. The nights were long, the cold was unrelenting, and any warmth you managed to find was fleeting. It wasn't a world made for comfort or for easy sleep. There were no warm blankets folded neatly at the foot of a modern bed, no heaters or central heating to warm your home. Instead, the people who lived through these times found ways to endure, to survive, and sometimes even to rest. In the wild, far from the comforts of the village, those first medieval winter nights would have felt like a test of endurance. Imagine your bones aching from the cold, your breath visible in the frigid air, and your body drawn tight with the tension of survival. There was no escape from the freezing temperatures, no relief from the bitter wind that whipped through the trees. The snow, thick and heavy, seemed to cover everything: trees, bushes, even the smallest crevices. The silence of the night was broken only by the wind and the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. But, no matter how harsh the world outside seemed, it was the inside of your shelter where you would face your greatest battle: sleep. Historians still argue about the precise nature of these medieval shelters. Some claim that early medieval people used simple huts made from wooden frames, woven with branches or covered with animal hides. Others suggest that caves or natural rock overhangs may have provided shelter for those without the skill or resources to build. Regardless of the structure, what mattered most was that it offered the smallest refuge against the brutal cold. These shelters were often dark, cramped, and damp, with little more than the warmth of a small fire to stave off the freezing night. But fire wasn't always reliable. Often, it was a struggle to keep it burning through the night. So, you would find yourself curled up near the flame, hoping that it would last until morning, your body drawing in whatever heat it could. The flickering shadows cast by the fire would dance on the walls of your shelter, but they were a reminder that your comfort was fleeting. Sleep would come in fits and starts, brief moments of rest, interrupted by the chill, the noise of the wind, and the awareness that at any moment the fire might go out. The cold would seep into your bones as you lay there, trying to sleep in the wilderness, wondering how long it would be until dawn. And yet, as impossible as it seems, sleep would come. It had to. The body needed it to survive, to repair itself, and to maintain the strength necessary to endure the next day's trials. The medieval people, though they faced unimaginable hardships, had a resilience that allowed them to sleep, even in the worst of conditions. Their bodies adapted, their minds found ways to cope, and in the stillness of the night, they would sleep, only to wake again with the first light of day to face another frozen world. The night is long and unforgiving, and the medieval wilderness offers no mercy. The wind, cold as steel, howls through the trees, a constant reminder of nature's power. Snowflakes whirl in the air, coating everything in a pristine, icy blanket. The world outside seems to be holding its breath, frozen, still, and waiting. You're huddled inside, beneath layers of animal skins, a small fire flickering weakly in the corner of your shelter. It casts shadows on the walls, the only source of light in an otherwise pitch-black world. You feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, the cold wrapping itself around your very bones. But for now, you are safe. Or so you think. The shelter itself, a makeshift refuge of wood and hide, is barely adequate. Medieval winter shelters were rarely built for comfort, they were built for survival. The structures were often cramped, with low ceilings that only allowed enough space for you to crouch or sit. There was little room for movement, and what space there was had to be shared. A family might huddle together in one corner, each person wrapped in layers of furs and wool, attempting to make themselves as small as possible to conserve warmth. At night, there would be little to do but try to sleep and hope that the fire didn't die out, leaving you exposed to the merciless cold. Historians still debate whether these early medieval shelters were always constructed with the same methods. Some claim that they were mostly built using a frame of wooden beams, covered with layers of bark or animal hides to keep the heat inside. Others argue that many of the poorer peasants had no means to build sturdy shelters, and instead took refuge in caves or under overhanging rocks. Both options offered some shelter, but none could fully protect from the harsh realities of the wilderness. No matter where you slept, the bitter cold always crept in at the edges under the door, through cracks in the walls, and across the floor. The fire, the one thing that might offer you warmth, was never guaranteed to last the night. Firewood was precious, and it wasn't always easy to find. In the dense forests where medieval people lived, wood was often used for building, for cooking, and for warmth. It wasn't the convenience we take for granted today. Wood had to be carefully gathered, chopped, and stored. Even in the worst winters, you'd have to ration your firewood carefully, using only what was necessary to stay warm. A single ember might be enough to keep the chill at bay for a few hours, but there were no guarantees. Imagine the tension as you lie in your bed, curled under layers of animal pelts, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening for the faint crackle of the fire. The wind howls outside, and the world seems to close in around you. You feel every gust, every shift in the air, as if the cold is coming for you. But you know that your only choice is to rest, to sleep if you can. Rest is essential for survival without it. Your body can't repair itself, and your mind can't stay sharp. But sleep in the wilderness is no simple task. It's not just the cold that makes sleep so elusive. The wilderness is full of dangers. The sounds of wolves howling in the distance, the rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. These sounds are constant reminders that the night is not always safe. In the wild, sleep isn't just about resting your body. It's about being vigilant, staying alert, and making sure that you're ready for anything. Some historians argue that the people who lived in the medieval wilderness developed an unusual sleep pattern because of the constant danger they faced. Instead of sleeping for long stretches like we do today, they may have slept in shorter intervals, waking up during the night to keep watch. This fragmented sleep cycle was a way of staying safe, ensuring that they were always aware of their surroundings. It was a survival tactic, born out of necessity. If you slept too soundly, you might miss the sounds of predators or enemies approaching. You had to be prepared to wake up at a moment's notice. But even if you managed to stay awake long enough to keep watch, there were still other obstacles. The cold, as mentioned, is the ever-present enemy. It seeps into everything, turning your skin into ice, numbing your limbs and freezing your breath in the air. But it isn't just the physical toll of the cold that makes sleep so difficult, it's the psychological toll. Living in the wilderness during the winter meant enduring isolation. Even though people often lived in small villages or communities, the vast expanse of wilderness around them created a sense of solitude. The dark winter nights felt endless, and the silence was deafening. You'd hear nothing but the wind howling, the occasional animal moving through the snow, and the distant call of birds. It could drive anyone mad, to be trapped in this frozen, empty world, surrounded by nothing but the cold. The harsh isolation, coupled with the constant struggle for warmth, would have taken a psychological toll on medieval people. But they did sleep. Somehow, despite the cold, the danger, and the solitude, they managed to close their eyes. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, the weariness of fighting the elements day after day. Or perhaps it was simply that sleep was a necessary escape from the harshness of reality. No matter how difficult the conditions were, sleep was still an essential part of their survival. As you lay there in the darkness, trying to block out the cold and the thoughts racing through your mind, you might wonder how people managed to stay sane. How did they endure the freezing nights and the endless stretches of cold? How did they find rest when everything around them was designed to keep them awake? One answer lies in the nature of sleep itself. It's not just about physical rest, it's also about mental escape. When you sleep, your mind enters a different state, one where the struggles of the day fade into the background, where the cold and the danger don't matter. For a few hours, you're free. And perhaps that was enough to help the people of the medieval wilderness survive. The medieval people didn't have the luxuries we have today, but they were resourceful. They made do with what they had, and they found ways to sleep despite the cold, the darkness, and the isolation. In some ways, their survival depended on it. The next day would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new battles with the elements. But for now, in the warmth of their shelter, with the fire flickering weakly in the corner, they could rest. It wouldn't be easy, but they would sleep. As the cold night drags on, you can hear the wind howling outside, a relentless reminder that nature itself seems to have a life of its own. The cold presses in from every angle, and the fire you've carefully stoked offers only brief comfort. You pull your furs tighter around your shoulders, hoping they'll be enough to keep you warm through the night. But as the hours tick by, it becomes clear that sleep will not come easily. The wilderness at night doesn't offer the luxury of a deep, uninterrupted rest. Instead, it's a night of shifting and turning, of trying to find warmth amidst the freezing air. Let's take a moment to consider the types of shelters people in the medieval wilderness would have used. In these harsh, unforgiving conditions, one of the most important considerations was finding or creating a shelter that could provide at least some semblance of warmth. While many people in medieval villages lived in sturdy homes made of stone or timber, those who found themselves in the wilderness had to be more resourceful. You likely would have found yourself inside a simple hut or a makeshift shelter built from whatever materials were available. These shelters were far from the cozy homes we envision today. Picture yourself huddling inside a structure made from logs, with walls of woven twigs and branches. Often these crude homes were covered with animal hides or layers of bark to help keep the wind out. Some medieval people also took refuge in caves or rock overhangs, though this option was often reserved for those who lacked the skills or resources to construct more permanent shelters. Regardless of the shelter's construction, it was unlikely to be particularly well insulated after all. Insulation as we know it today wasn't available. Instead, the people of the time relied on what nature provided: firewood, animal skins, and the warmth of their own bodies. In fact, fire played such a central role in medieval winter survival that it could be considered the heart of the home even in a rudimentary shelter. The warmth it provided was a literal lifeline during the bitter cold. But fire in the wilderness wasn't always easy to maintain. The wood could get damp from the snow, or worse, it could burn out faster than you anticipated. One of the most challenging aspects of medieval life in the wild was finding enough firewood to sustain a fire throughout the night. It's important to note that fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was also a symbol of safety. The crackling of the fire offered some comfort in an otherwise silent and eerie landscape. The occasional snap of the flames would keep the darkness at bay, its glow providing a fleeting sense of security. Yet, even with a fire, sleep would be difficult to come by. The fear of it dying out, the constant shivering from the cold, and the awareness that you were not entirely safe would make it hard to relax. A widely accepted truth in historical studies is that the cold during medieval winters was brutal and unrelenting. While today's standards of winter clothing have evolved dramatically, medieval people had only basic furs and wool to protect them. The best they could do was layer up, hoping that their clothing would trap enough body heat to keep them alive. You could picture yourself wearing several layers of rough-spun wool, topped with a thick fur cloak. The furs of animals like bears, wolves, or even deer would have been essential for survival. These furs acted as an insulating layer, helping to preserve warmth and protect the skin from frostbite. Despite these efforts, frostbite was still a real threat, and many medieval people faced serious cold-related injuries. The thin fabric of wool was effective at keeping some warmth in, but it didn't compare to modern insulated clothing. You could imagine the biting cold nipping at your toes and fingers, a constant reminder that survival was tenuous at best. In many cases, the danger of freezing was as much a part of medieval winters as the snow itself. A curious little piece of history, though, is that medieval people were surprisingly resourceful when it came to their clothing. For instance, many believed that wearing multiple layers of clothing, including garments made from animal intestines or wool, could ward off the chill. These materials were often far from pleasant to wear, but in the face of such extreme cold, comfort was secondary to survival. You might find yourself donning a pair of boots made from the hides of animals, with thick soles to protect against the frozen ground. But no matter how many layers you piled on, the cold would always find a way in, creeping through every crack and crevice of your shelter. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval people could truly escape the cold during their winter nights. Were they ever really warm, or did they simply endure the freezing temperatures in an endless battle of survival? Some scholars suggest that medieval people simply grew accustomed to the cold, their bodies adapting to the harsh conditions. Others argue that they experienced constant discomfort, and their sleep was often restless due to the cold. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Survival was, after all, about adaptation. But even the most resilient person would find it difficult to sleep soundly in such conditions. And yet, sleep did come. Even with the fear, the discomfort, and the relentless cold, there were moments when the body simply needed to rest, and rest would come in fits and starts. Perhaps, after hours of lying awake, your body would succumb to exhaustion, slipping into a shallow sleep. But in the wilderness, even sleep was unpredictable. There would be times when you'd wake in the middle of the night, shivering, with the fire dimming and the cold creeping in once again. One thing that might help you sleep, despite the cold, would be the company of others. People living in the wilderness during these brutal winters often shared their shelter with others. The more people in the shelter, the more body heat there would be to go around. Family members would huddle together in close quarters, often sleeping in one shared space. The warmth of a loved one could make all the difference on a night when the cold felt unbearable. But even in the midst of company, the wilderness could feel isolating, especially when you could hear the distant howls of wolves or the rustling of branches in the night. The nights in the wilderness were a mix of loneliness, danger, and shared survival. You might feel comforted by the sound of breathing nearby, the low murmur of conversation as people tried to ease the tension, but you'd also know that you were at the mercy of the elements. The world outside might be frozen, dark, and dangerous, but for now, as you lie huddled in your makeshift shelter, you have the fleeting warmth of your fire and the companionship of others. But sleep, as always, remains elusive. The silence of the wilderness is broken only by the occasional snap of wood as it burns, the wind that whips through the trees, and the faint howls of animals in the distance. The temperature has dropped further, and you feel the cold press against your skin, despite the thick layers of furs and wool wrapped tightly around you. The warmth of the fire seems to be nothing more than an illusion now, a fading ember in a sea of cold. You shift in your bed of animal skins, trying to make yourself more comfortable, but it's hard to escape the biting chill that seems to have taken over your very bones. For a moment, you might wonder how anyone could sleep in such conditions. Yet sleep, despite the discomfort, is an essential part of survival in the wilderness. It is not only about rest, it's about healing, recovering the strength needed to face the next day's challenges. But in the medieval wilderness, sleep was never a guarantee. It was fleeting, fragile, and always at odds with the constant demands of survival. One of the key aspects of surviving the harsh winters in the medieval wilderness was the use of natural materials to create bedding and warmth. As you lie on a bed of rough animal pelts, it's worth considering what went into crafting this humble mattress. While we may take our modern beds for granted, the medieval world had to make do with what was available. Straw, hay, and leaves were often used to fill bedding, providing a small cushion against the hard, cold ground. These natural materials were not ideal, but they were the best that could be done with the limited resources available. Imagine yourself lying there, surrounded by the smell of damp straw and the roughness of animal skins. Despite their warmth, the furs were no substitute for the comfort we might find in modern bedding. In the dead of winter, with the wind howling outside, you'd have to use every trick in the book to conserve warmth. Layers upon layers of fabric animal hides, woolen garments, and rough blankets would provide some respite, but it was never enough. The cold would seep in no matter how tightly you bundled yourself up. Historians still argue whether medieval people used these materials purely for insulation or whether there was also a spiritual or cultural aspect to how they slept. Some scholars suggest that sleeping on animal skins had symbolic meaning, representing a connection to nature or the animals they hunted. Others point out that the practice may have simply been practical. Animal pelts were the most readily available materials for warmth. But regardless of the reasoning, these materials were an essential part of the medieval sleep experience, as they offered the only protection against the freezing temperatures. As you lie in your bed, trying to make yourself as comfortable as possible, you might also notice the strange sensation of the cold air seeping through the walls of your shelter. Medieval homes and huts were not built with the precision and insulation techniques we take for granted today. Gaps in the walls or cracks in the roof would allow the cold to enter, making it difficult to maintain any sense of warmth. The structure itself was a temporary barrier, not a permanent solution to the cold. This lack of insulation meant that, even with a fire, the shelter could never be fully protected from the winter chill. One quirky tidbit of history, however, is that medieval people weren't completely unaware of the need for insulation. They often lined the walls of their shelters with moss or straw to create a kind of makeshift insulation. While it might not have been as effective as modern materials, it helped to slow the infiltration of cold air. It was a small, practical measure in an otherwise harsh environment. But even with these efforts, the nights in the wilderness were still brutal. The constant presence of the cold also had a profound effect on the quality of sleep. The body, when exposed to prolonged cold, can go into a kind of survival mode, where sleep becomes fragmented and restless. The cold doesn't just make it harder to sleep, it also disturbs the natural sleep cycle. People in the medieval wilderness likely experienced what's known as segmented sleep, a pattern where the night is divided into 2 or more phases. This could mean sleeping for a few hours, then waking up during the night to stoke the fire, check the shelter, or simply stay alert to the sounds of the wilderness. The idea of segmented sleep challenges our modern assumptions about rest. Today, we often think of sleep as something we do in one long, uninterrupted stretch. But in the medieval world, where danger and discomfort were constant, sleep was never a simple, unbroken experience. People would sleep in fits and starts, waking up throughout the night, sometimes to tend to the fire, other times to listen for predators or other threats. It's a stark contrast to the peaceful, undisturbed sleep that we often take for granted in our modern homes. Scholars still debate the exact nature of medieval sleep patterns. Some believe that segmented sleep was a widespread practice, while others argue that it may have been more of a cultural or regional anomaly. What is clear, however, is that the cold winters of medieval life required people to adapt their sleeping habits to the environment. The need for warmth and the constant presence of danger meant that sleep could never be the peaceful, uninterrupted escape it is for us today. One of the factors that made segmented sleep so necessary was the importance of fire. The fire, as mentioned earlier, was the only source of warmth and light in the shelter, and it was a lifeline during the cold winter nights. But keeping the fire going wasn't a simple task. Wood was in limited supply, and fires often needed to be tended to regularly to ensure they didn't go out. You might wake up in the middle of the night, groggy and cold, to find that the fire has dimmed or gone out entirely. In such a case, you would need to get up, gather more wood, and reignite the flames. The constant need to manage the fire contributed to the fragmented nature of sleep. It wasn't just about resting, it was about ensuring your survival through the night. Beyond the fire, there was also the matter of the constant threat from wildlife. Wolves, bears, and other predators were common in the medieval wilderness, and they posed a constant risk to those living in the wild. The howl of a wolf in the distance would send a chill through your spine, reminding you that you were never truly safe. Even as you tried to rest, you would have to stay alert, listening for any sounds that might signal danger. The fear of predators, coupled with the need to maintain the fire, would often disrupt sleep, leaving you with a constant sense of vigilance. The act of sleeping in the wilderness, then, was as much about staying alive as it was about rest. It was a delicate balance between exhaustion and survival, between the need for warmth and the ever-present threat of the cold. Even when sleep did come, it was often shallow and fragmented, with the mind constantly alert, prepared to wake at a moment's notice if danger approached. This constant state of readiness made sleep a luxury, not a given, and it's hard to imagine how anyone could sleep soundly through the brutal medieval winters. As the fire crackles and pops in the corner of your shelter, the warmth it provides feels like a fleeting gift, something to cling to before the cold rushes back in. You lie there, tucked beneath the rough furs, still awake, your mind racing through the reality of what you face. Every moment in the wilderness is a fight for survival, and sleep is no exception. The sensation of cold creeping in is never far away, like an old friend who refuses to leave. The shelter is small, and it seems as though the cold has a way of finding its way inside, through the smallest cracks in the walls, or the gaps between the animal hides draped over the shelter's frame. In the medieval wilderness, the struggle against the cold was omnipresent. The frostbite, the numbness in your limbs, the stinging cold in your nose, all of it would keep you awake, wondering if you could survive another night. But then, eventually, your body would succumb to exhaustion. You might finally fall into a restless sleep, your body and mind deprived of the deep rest they desperately needed. The medieval people who lived in these conditions were no strangers to the ways in which the cold affected their bodies. It's widely accepted that during the harsh winters, the body's natural temperature regulation was constantly in flux, with heat being rapidly lost to the cold, especially when the fire burned low. But it wasn't just the physical toll that kept people awake during the night. It was the mental exhaustion too. Living in a state of constant vigilance, always prepared to wake at any moment, meant that sleep was often light and fragmented. But what does this constant battle against the cold do to the body over time? Let's consider how the medieval people coped. The body's response to prolonged exposure to cold wasn't just about feeling uncomfortable. It could lead to real physical harm. Frostbite, of course, was a constant threat, as it is when exposed to freezing temperatures for extended periods. The numbness that would have crept into your fingers and toes would have made it difficult to even move at times. And yet, you had no choice but to continue, to find ways to survive another night, another day. The warmth from the fire was critical, but firewood wasn't infinite. The amount of wood you could gather and store was limited by what the environment provided. Without the luxury of modern tools to chop wood efficiently, medieval people often had to rely on manual labor to gather firewood, and once it was gone, there was no simple solution. In the dead of winter, the search for firewood could turn into a perilous journey, leaving you exposed to the elements. A well-maintained fire wasn't just a convenience, it was a lifeline. And yet, this lifeline was always in danger of going out, its warmth, a fragile, fleeting hope. One well-documented aspect of medieval life was the ingenuity people displayed in the face of such challenges. In the absence of proper insulation and heating technology, they turned to the materials around them, animal skins, straw, and even the very earth itself to create as much warmth as possible. In fact, many medieval shelters featured a kind of rudimentary insulation, where walls were lined with moss or straw. This helped to slow the passage of cold air into the shelter, but it could never fully block it out. The struggle against the cold was an ongoing one. You could do everything right, pile on the furs, stoke the fire, and still find yourself lying awake, chilled to the bone. A fascinating but lesser-known historical tidbit comes from the medieval use of animal dung. Yes, animal waste was often used as a material to help maintain warmth in shelters. In many cultures, people would mix cow or horse dung with straw and use it as an insulating material for their huts. It may sound strange, but this practice wasn't unique to the medieval period. In fact, animal dung was used as an effective natural insulation method, and its presence would help keep the shelter warm and dry. Although far from pleasant, the practice was yet another example of the creativity and adaptability of medieval people who had to make use of whatever they could find in the natural world. This inventive use of materials wasn't just about warmth, it was also a matter of comfort. The layered construction of bedding, including straw-filled mattresses and piles of animal pelts, allowed for the creation of a space where you could at least find some semblance of relief from the cold. You might imagine the discomfort of lying on a straw mattress, constantly shifting to try and find the least uncomfortable position. Despite these challenges, medieval people were able to sleep, even if only in short intervals, throughout the night. Historians still argue about the extent to which these strategies actually helped in protecting against the cold. Some suggest that medieval people may have grown accustomed to the harshness of their environment, developing a tolerance for the cold over time. Others point out that, despite their resourcefulness, the threat of frostbite and hypothermia was a very real part of their experience. Even with multiple layers of clothing and the best efforts to insulate their shelters, survival was never a guarantee. The issue of insulation and the methods medieval people used to keep out the cold continues to be a subject of scholarly discussion. Some believe that people in the medieval era were far more resilient to the cold than we give them credit for, learning to live with it rather than attempting to fully combat it. Others suggest that the cold was so pervasive and unrelenting that medieval people had no choice but to adapt to living with discomfort on a constant basis. Either way, it's clear that the struggle to stay warm and find rest was a central aspect of life in the medieval wilderness. It's impossible to overstate how the elements shaped the medieval experience. From the way people built their shelters to the strategies they employed for staying warm, survival during the winter months required constant ingenuity and adaptability. Yet, even with all the resourcefulness they had at their disposal, the cold remained an unyielding adversary, one that people could only try to manage, never truly overcome. So, as you lie there in your makeshift shelter, listening to the howling wind outside and feeling the cold creep in, it becomes clear that sleep is more than just rest, it's a rare and fleeting victory. You find yourself drifting in and out of light slumber, waking frequently to adjust your position, stoke the fire, or simply shiver away the numbness that sets in. And yet, even in these moments of restless sleep, you are resilient, you endure. Tomorrow will bring another day of struggle, another night to survive. But for now, in the fleeting warmth of your fire, you allow yourself a moment of rest, however imperfect it may be. The hours seem to stretch on forever, a never-ending cycle of discomfort and fleeting warmth. Every time you begin to drift off, the cold rushes in again, like an unwelcome guest, reminding you that no amount of fire or fur can truly protect you from the harshness of the wilderness. And yet, even amidst the discomfort, sleep is something you must have. You need it to survive, to recharge, to gather strength for the next day of battling the elements. As you lie there, trying to sleep in fits and starts, you might find yourself thinking about how different this is from the world you know today. There's no electric light, no constant hum of the modern world to drown out the silence of the night. The only sounds you hear are the crackling of the fire, the wind howling outside, and perhaps the distant rustling of wildlife, maybe even the snap of a twig, signaling the approach of something dangerous. The wilderness is alive with sound, yet it is also unbearably quiet. It's a paradox, and it's this stark silence, punctuated by the occasional noise, that creates such an eerie atmosphere. The psychological toll of this environment can't be underestimated. In today's world, we often think of sleep as something we can take for granted, a time to rest, to relax, to escape from the demands of the day. But in the medieval wilderness, sleep was far from a luxury. It was a necessity, a fragile gift you had to fight for. The cold, the isolation, the constant awareness of potential danger, these all weighed heavily on the mind and kept sleep elusive. You never quite felt safe, and that lack of security could make even the simplest act of sleeping feel like an impossible task. But it wasn't just the environment that made sleep difficult. It was also the routines and practices that people in medieval times had to adopt in order to survive. As mentioned earlier, the medieval people often lived in close quarters, sharing their shelters with others. This communal aspect of sleeping, though a source of warmth, also brought its own set of challenges. You were not alone in your struggle to survive the winter, but your companions weren't necessarily the comfort you might imagine. There were no private spaces, no individual bedrooms to retreat to after a long day. Instead, you shared the space with your family, your neighbors, or even strangers. Everyone was in it together, huddling for warmth, trying to get some rest despite the cramped conditions. A commonly recognized fact about medieval winter life is that people were often forced to sleep in close proximity to one another, sometimes in spaces so small that personal space didn't exist. This was an essential part of survival. The more bodies in the shelter, the more heat would be retained. But with so many people sharing such close quarters, the chances of a good night's sleep were slim. The body heat of others was crucial, but it also came with the discomfort of being unable to move freely or sleep undisturbed. The warmth from your companions was a double-edged sword, offering comfort, but also crowding your space. A fascinating but lesser-known aspect of communal sleeping in medieval shelters is that it wasn't always just people who shared these spaces. In some cases, people would share their sleeping arrangements with animals. The family dog, the farm animals, and even livestock might be brought inside to sleep with their human companions. This was especially true for people living in more rural areas, where animals were vital to daily life. While it may sound strange to us today, this practice was essential for survival, as animals could offer not just warmth, but also a sense of security. At least, that's how it was seen at the time. The idea of animals in the same space as people was not viewed as unusual or unclean, rather. It was a pragmatic solution in a world where every bit of warmth counted. Interestingly, some historians suggest that these close quarters may have actually fostered a sense of togetherness that transcended the discomfort. Families, communities, and even animals sleeping in close proximity could have created a sense of unity and shared purpose. Though sleep was often restless and fragmented, the communal aspect of it may have helped ease the emotional toll of living in such harsh conditions. The human need for connection, even during the hardest of times, couldn't be ignored. It's possible that, in the darkness of those long nights, the presence of others, whether human or animal, offered something beyond warmth. It might have been the comfort of knowing that, for better or worse, you weren't alone. However, despite the companionship, the cold was always present, always pressing in. Even with the bodies around you, the layers of clothing, and the furs piled on top of one another, it was difficult to escape the icy grip of the night. The warmth provided by your companions and the fire was often fleeting, and the cold always returned. Your body would remain tense, shivering occasionally, as the warmth slipped away, replaced by the biting chill of the wilderness. Even when you closed your eyes, the cold was there, like a shadow, always lurking. A quirky little historical fact is that medieval people often viewed winter as a kind of testing period. There was a belief that surviving the harsh winters, especially those spent in the wilderness, was proof of one's resilience and strength. The winters weren't just something to endure, they were a crucible, a measure of a person's ability to withstand hardship. For medieval people, braving the cold wasn't just about survival, it was about proving their toughness, about showing that they could conquer nature itself. In some ways, surviving the night was as much a spiritual triumph as it was a physical one. It was a victory over the elements, over the harsh forces of nature that sought to tear them down. Scholars still debate the role of sleep in medieval life, particularly when it came to the cold. How much of their sleep was truly restorative, and how much was simply a desperate attempt to stay functional in an environment that seemed intent on breaking them? Was the sleep they got enough to replenish their bodies and minds, or were they living in a constant state of exhaustion? These are questions that remain unanswered, and the answer likely lies somewhere in the balance between human resilience and the limitations of the environment. For you, lying there in your shelter, shivering and trying to sleep, it's hard to imagine how people managed to sleep soundly in such conditions, and yet, somehow, they did. They survived, not just the cold, but the mental and emotional toll of living in constant discomfort. Sleep, however imperfect and fragmented, was a part of the survival process. It was essential, even if it never quite felt like rest. And tomorrow, you'd wake again, ready to face the bitter cold, to stoke the fire, to survive another night. The wind howls outside, its icy fingers reaching through the gaps in the shelter. The fire flickers, casting long shadows across the walls as it struggles to stay alive. You shift again, the cold inescapable despite the layers of clothing and furs wrapped around your body. The shelter feels smaller as the night drags on, its walls seemingly closing in with the weight of the cold. Despite the tight quarters and the heat of the fire, sleep remains elusive. It's not just the cold that keeps you awake, it's the awareness of the danger outside, the sense that you're never truly safe. There's no guarantee that the fire will last, or that the shelter will hold. Every crack in the walls, every gust of wind, is a reminder that nature is unforgiving. As you lie there, restless, it's worth considering how people in the medieval wilderness coped with this constant state of vigilance. Sleep was never easy, and the cold made it that much harder to find rest. But in the absence of the comforts we have today, people learned to adapt, finding ways to make the best of their circumstances. The fire, though never truly sufficient to keep out the cold, was the key to survival. It was more than just a source of warmth, it was a source of light, comfort, and safety in an otherwise dark and cold world. But it was a fragile comfort, a flickering flame that could disappear in an instant. The medieval people relied on more than just fire for warmth. They used whatever resources were available to them, including the very ground they slept on. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval winter life is how people utilized the earth itself to help insulate their shelters. Many medieval shelters, especially those in rural areas, were built into the ground, often with earth-packed walls. This helped to regulate the temperature inside, offering a small degree of warmth in an otherwise harsh environment. Some historians argue that these earthen homes may have been more effective at trapping heat than wooden structures, but they also came with their own set of challenges. The earth itself was cold, and the moisture that seeped in from the ground could make it difficult to stay dry, especially during the long, wet winters. Historians still argue over the specific methods used to construct these earth homes. Some suggest that medieval people may have used stone foundations and clay to help insulate their shelters, while others point to the use of sod or turf as the primary material. Regardless of the exact construction methods, it's clear that the earth was a crucial element in medieval winter survival. These homes were far from comfortable, but they provided a layer of protection from the cold, a small barrier between the inhabitants and the freezing temperatures outside. But even the best shelter, made with the finest materials, could not offer complete protection from the elements. A quirky little historical tidbit comes from the fact that medieval people were known to use animal dung not only as a building material but also as a heating source. In many rural areas, animal waste was dried and used as a kind of fuel for the fire. It might seem unpleasant by modern standards, but in the medieval wilderness, anything that could provide warmth was valuable. The practice of using dried animal dung as fuel was widespread, especially in regions where firewood was scarce. It may have smelled less than pleasant, but it was a practical solution in a world where warmth was a matter of life and death. Even with the fire burning brightly, the need for sleep remained. And yet, despite your body's exhaustion, it's difficult to fully rest. Every movement in the shelter, every creak of the wooden frame, seems to amplify the stillness of the night. Your senses are heightened, alert to every sound, every shift in the air. The knowledge that something, whether an animal, a rival, or the cold itself, could disrupt your rest at any moment is a constant presence. You lie there, the fire flickering low, the cold creeping back in. Your body aches from the long hours of trying to sleep, but your mind stays active, racing through the realities of survival. One of the more established facts about medieval winter survival is the importance of shared warmth. It wasn't just the fire or the furs that kept people alive during the brutal winters, it was the human connection. People huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed closely together, sharing what little heat they could. Families slept in close proximity, sometimes in a single large bed or in a small communal space. The more people you had, the more body heat you could share. The communal nature of medieval life meant that even in the most inhospitable conditions, people were never truly alone. The bond of family, of shared hardship, was as vital to survival as the fire or the animal skins. Scholars still debate the psychological effects of this communal living on medieval people. Some suggest that the close quarters helped foster a sense of unity and security, even in the most difficult of times. Others argue that the lack of privacy and the constant presence of others could have contributed to a sense of claustrophobia or stress. Either way, it's clear that the survival of the community was just as important as the survival of the individual. In the wilderness, you weren't just surviving for yourself, you were surviving for everyone around you. The shared effort to stay warm, to stay safe, to find rest in the midst of the cold, was the foundation of life during those harsh winters. The night continues on, and though the fire has dwindled to a faint glow, you still feel the warmth of the people around you, the shared heat that keeps the worst of the cold at bay. But sleep, as always, remains elusive. You lie there, surrounded by the sounds of breathing, the crackling fire, and the wind howling outside. Your body is exhausted, your mind too, but sleep still doesn't come easily. The cold, the danger, the uncertainty, they all hang in the air, just out of reach. And yet, somehow, you manage, you endure, you survive. Tomorrow will bring more challenges, more cold, more struggles. But for now, in this fleeting moment, you rest. And when the dawn comes, you will face it, knowing that you've made it through another night. That, after all, is what survival is all about. The first light of dawn filters faintly through the cracks in your shelter, casting a pale glow on the rough walls of the room. The fire, which had been a constant source of warmth and light through the night, now flickers weakly, its embers smouldering in the early morning chill. The air is still cold, the remnants of the night's freeze lingering in the corners of your shelter. You stir, stretching your stiff limbs beneath the layers of furs and wool. Your body aches from the restless sleep, from the hours spent huddling against the cold, but there's no time to linger. You must rise, for survival doesn't stop, even when the warmth of the fire is gone. A well-documented fact about medieval life is that people didn't have the luxury of long, restful nights. The struggle for warmth was constant, and even the comfort of sleep was always interrupted by the harsh reality of living in the wilderness. Yet, despite these hardships, people found ways to survive, to adapt, and to rise each day, ready to face the challenges of the cold, unforgiving world. The act of waking up in the medieval wilderness wasn't just about stretching out from sleep, it was about finding the strength to continue, to endure another day. As you get up, you notice the frost that has formed on the edges of your shelter. The cold never truly leaves. It only takes temporary respite when the fire is burning bright. You gather your belongings, put on your thickest garments, and step outside into the winter wilderness. The world around you is a picture of icy beauty. Trees are coated in a layer of snow. The ground beneath your feet crackles with the frost. The sun, weak and distant, offers no real warmth, merely a faint promise of light. The wilderness feels alive with cold and silence, a world that waits for no one. For medieval people, the act of waking up and stepping into the wilderness every day was an act of defiance against the cold. The elements might have been relentless, but the will to survive was stronger. You can imagine the exhaustion that would come with facing these same conditions every day. The work was never done, whether it was gathering firewood, hunting for food, or reinforcing your shelter. There was always something that needed to be done in the fight against the winter. But the struggle wasn't just physical, it was emotional as well. The isolation, the constant awareness of danger, the never-ending cold, all of these wore away at the spirit. Yet still, the people of medieval times found ways to persevere. A fascinating historical detail is that some medieval people had specific routines to help them cope with the cold. They would rise early in the morning to tend to the fire, to gather what little warmth they could, and to prepare for the day. The practice of morning fire tending wasn't just about keeping warm, it was a ritual, a way of asserting control over the elements. Starting the day with a flicker of warmth from the fire was a small victory, a moment of reassurance that they could face another day, no matter how cold it was. Yet, despite the morning rituals and the work of surviving another winter day, there were still moments of respite, however brief, during the day. For medieval people, any time spent in the warmth of the hearth was precious. These moments were not just about escaping the cold, they were moments of solace, times when the body could rest and the mind could find some peace. In these fleeting moments, people would gather around the fire, share stories, or simply sit in silence, allowing themselves to take a brief break from the constant struggle for survival. Even in the harshest of times, these small rituals, these moments of shared warmth, help to ease the emotional toll of the long winters. Historians still debate the psychological effects of living through these winters. Some argue that the isolation and hardship of medieval winter life led to a hardened, resilient character in people, while others suggest that the mental toll of such hardships was immense, leading to depression and despair. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. While people were undoubtedly resilient, they were also affected by the relentless cold, isolation, and the constant danger that loomed in the wilderness. But even in the face of these challenges, the human capacity for adaptation and endurance remained. Despite the brutal realities of medieval winters, people continued to wake up each day, to fight against the elements, to survive. As you step further into the wilderness, the wind bites at your face, the snow crunching beneath your boots. The forest around you feels like a different world, a world full of danger and beauty, silence and sound. The wilderness may seem endless, but in a strange way, it is also full of opportunity. The cold might be fierce, but it is also a reminder that you are alive, that you are strong enough to face another day. And while the night will come again, with its long hours and endless cold, there's a strange comfort in knowing that you've made it through the night. For in the wilderness, survival is never guaranteed, but the will to keep going is always present. A key point in medieval survival was not just about the physical effort required to endure the winter, it was about the mental fortitude needed to keep going. Scholars still argue about how medieval people managed to cope mentally with the daily struggle for survival. Was the mental resilience they exhibited a product of necessity, or was it a deep-rooted aspect of their culture? Perhaps it was a bit of both. Survival required constant adaptation physically, mentally, and emotionally. The long winters forced people to find ways to endure, to adjust, and to stay strong, even when the odds seemed impossible. And so, as you begin your work for the day, preparing for another long stretch of survival, you know that the cycle will continue. Each day will bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but also new moments of triumph. The fire will flicker, the shelter will stand, and despite the cold and the hardship, you will carry on. The wilderness may be harsh, but it is also a testament to the strength of those who lived through it, who endured the worst of the cold and emerged each day, ready to face another fight for survival. The day carries on in its quiet rhythm, a relentless cycle of effort and survival. The sun, pale and distant, offers no real warmth, but at least it provides light, enough to make the wilderness seem less daunting. As you move through the snow, each step is a reminder of the cold that is never far from your body. The landscape, both beautiful and brutal, stretches out around you, the trees heavy with snow, the sky a pale, endless grey. The world feels suspended in time, as if the cold has frozen everything in place. The medieval wilderness was a land where every task, no matter how small, was a matter of survival. Nothing could be taken for granted, especially during the winter months. The act of simply gathering firewood or hunting for food required immense effort. These tasks, which we might consider mundane today, were vital to staying alive. In the face of the cold, every movement felt more laborious, every breath a struggle. The cold seeped into everything, from the ground beneath your feet to the air in your lungs. Historians often highlight how crucial firewood was in the medieval wilderness. Without enough wood, a fire could easily go out, leaving you exposed to the bitter cold of the night. The search for firewood was a daily task, one that could take hours or even days depending on where you were. The trees in the forest were your lifeline, and chopping wood wasn't just a chore, it was a survival necessity. Some communities developed ingenious methods for storing firewood, stacking it high and keeping it dry. But even the best preparations could be undone by the whims of the weather. A wet winter could make firewood difficult to gather, as the snow and rain could leave the wood damp and difficult to ignite. In these times, the struggle for warmth became even more daunting. But the battle against the cold was not just about gathering firewood or maintaining a fire. It was also about how you navigated the landscape itself. The snow, which covered the ground and blanketed the trees, made every step a challenge. Moving through the wilderness in winter was like moving through a different world, a world that fought back at every turn. The ground, frozen solid, would often crack and creak underfoot, and the snow could become so deep that it slowed your movements to a crawl. Traveling from one place to another, whether to gather firewood, hunt, or check on neighbors, was no simple task. Every journey through the snow required planning, energy, and a level of resilience that would be hard to imagine for most today. A lesser-known but important historical tidbit is that medieval people also had to be experts in reading the weather. They didn't have modern meteorology to guide them, so they relied on their senses and knowledge of nature to predict the weather. The patterns of the wind, the behavior of animals, and the state of the sky were all signals that people used to determine when a storm was coming or when it was safe to travel. This deep connection to the environment, to the subtle cues of nature, was a crucial skill for survival. The ability to read the weather could mean the difference between finding shelter before a snowstorm or being caught in a blizzard unprepared. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval people understood the weather. Some scholars suggest that they had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the natural world, while others argue that the reliance on instincts and local knowledge was more basic. Regardless, it is clear that people in medieval times had to be incredibly attuned to the rhythms of nature to survive, especially during the long winter months. Their ability to read the signs of the environment gave them a survival advantage, but it also made them keenly aware of just how fragile their lives were in the face of the elements. And yet, despite the constant struggle to stay warm and safe, there were moments of peace. The brief respite when the sun appeared, when you could sit by the fire and warm your hands, when you could pause for a moment and breathe. These moments were rare, but they were essential to survival. Even though life in the wilderness was full of hardships, there were small victories along the way, moments of warmth, moments of community, moments of rest. These were the moments that made it possible to endure, to keep moving forward. As you return to your shelter at the end of the day, tired from your labor in the snow, you can feel the weight of the cold lifting slightly. The fire, though small and weak, is still burning, and it offers a brief moment of warmth. You sit close to it, feeling the heat slowly seep into your limbs. You're not warm, not completely, but it's enough to make the night feel a little less harsh. The cold is still there, lurking just outside, but for now, inside your shelter, you can rest. The fire crackles softly. The shadows on the walls flicker and dance. The world outside seems distant, as if it's not quite real, and for a few precious moments, you can forget the cold. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval period, despite its many challenges, was a time of incredible adaptability. People didn't have the luxury of modern technology or comforts, but they had something just as important: the ability to adapt to their environment, to make do with what they had, and to persevere through even the harshest winters. This adaptability is what allowed them to survive in the wilderness, to find warmth and shelter when the world around them seemed designed to freeze them out. And while modern life may seem far removed from this struggle, it's worth remembering that resilience in the face of hardship is a timeless human trait. The night stretches on, and the fire continues to burn, a small beacon of warmth in the endless cold. The temperature inside the shelter begins to drop again, but the fire still provides a bit of comfort. You know that the cold will always be there, just outside the shelter, but for now, inside, you're safe. The rhythm of the wilderness, the cycles of day and night, cold and warmth continues, relentless and unyielding. You can rest now, knowing that tomorrow will bring more work, more struggle, and more survival. But for now, in the flickering firelight, you can sleep. You can rest, even if only for a moment. The night stretches before you, its chill creeping through the shelter once more as the fire weakens and burns low. The warmth it offers is fleeting, and the cold outside steadily pushes in. You shiver under the heavy furs, trying to find some comfort, but the cold always finds its way in through the gaps in the walls, through the cracks in the shelter's framework. The night is long, and as the hours tick by, the struggle for warmth becomes an endless cycle of shifting, curling into the furs tighter, wishing for even a little more heat. The shelter itself, while offering some refuge, is far from a guarantee of warmth. Even the best-built medieval shelters weren't immune to the relentless cold of winter. The stone huts, the wooden shelters, the lean-tos, and even the caves each had its vulnerabilities. The medieval period saw some of the most resourceful shelter-building techniques. People used the materials they had, from the bones of animals to the timber of trees, from animal skins to stones, making sure that they could survive. But with all the ingenuity in the world, there was still no substitute for the elements. The cold was a constant threat, and no matter how skillfully a shelter was made, it could never fully shield you from the cruel bite of winter. This constant confrontation with the elements left a lasting mark on the people who lived through these winters. A well-known fact among historians is that the way medieval people adapted to the cold played a huge part in their survival. Clothing made from thick wool, fur-lined garments, and the layered use of skins provided the necessary insulation. Yet, even with all these precautions, the cold still took its toll. Frostbite was common, especially in the extremities. It's easy to imagine how the tips of your fingers, your toes, or even your nose could go numb after prolonged exposure to such brutal temperatures. The body's natural reaction to cold is to slow blood flow to the extremities to conserve heat, which often led to frostbite or, worse, the loss of fingers or toes. There's a quirky little tidbit about medieval methods of combating frostbite. While today we might have fancy medical treatments or heating pads, medieval people used something far more primitive and unexpected: urine. Some accounts suggest that people would use urine to thaw out frozen extremities. The heat from the urine would provide enough warmth to thaw frozen flesh, albeit in a very uncomfortable and unsanitary manner. While this may sound shocking, it was one of the few methods available at the time for dealing with frostbite, particularly in remote areas where access to medical care was scarce. And yet, even with this primitive knowledge of survival, frostbite was still a real danger. In addition to the immediate threat of losing fingers or toes to the cold, prolonged exposure to such harsh conditions led to long-term health problems. The body became more susceptible to illness, and the immune system, constantly taxed by the cold and the strain of survival, became weaker. In this way, the cold didn't just take away comfort, it took away the very ability to thrive. But survival in the medieval wilderness wasn't just about physical endurance, it was also about mental fortitude. The isolation and fear of danger constantly looming in the background weighed heavily on the mind. While you might spend the day working hard to gather firewood or hunt for food, it was the long, lonely nights that seemed to wear away at the spirit. The fear of predators, the isolation from other humans, the never-ending cold, it all took its toll. But it was also during these long nights that people found ways to cope, to keep their sanity intact. A particularly common form of coping was the telling of stories. In the cold wilderness, where survival was never certain and danger was always near, storytelling became a way to connect with others, to pass the long, lonely hours of the night. The warmth of the fire provided a safe space for stories, both real and imagined. In these stories, people found meaning in the harshness of their world. Myths and legends would be passed down from one generation to the next, helping to ease the mental strain of life in such a brutal environment. Historians still debate how much of medieval storytelling was about escapism versus practical knowledge. Some scholars suggest that these stories were a way for people to escape the reality of their world, to imagine a world less harsh, less cold. Others argue that these stories were more practical, offering knowledge about survival tactics, about how to deal with the cold, or about how to navigate the wilderness. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Storytelling was a way of both coping with the immediate stresses of survival and preserving the knowledge needed to thrive in the wilderness. As the night continues, you find yourself drifting in and out of a light, restless sleep. The fire flickers and crackles, the warmth it offers a fleeting comfort. The cold, ever present, presses in on you, but the sounds of the wilderness, the howling wind, the distant calls of animals are a reminder that you are not alone. The night may be long, but in these moments of darkness, you are surrounded by others. There's warmth in that, even if it's not the warmth you were hoping for. One of the most enduring aspects of medieval winter survival was the importance of community. In a world where danger was ever present and survival was a matter of life and death, the strength of the community was crucial. People didn't just share warmth, they shared work, knowledge, and stories. This shared effort helped people endure the harsh winters, giving them the strength to face the cold each day. Scholars still argue about the nature of medieval communities, particularly during the winter months. Were these communities more resilient because they banded together, or were they constantly on the edge of breaking down due to the strain of survival? Some believe that the harsh winters created tight-knit bonds, as people were forced to rely on one another. Others suggest that the stress of constant survival may have led to more tension and conflict. Whatever the reality, the bonds formed in these difficult times were an essential part of life in the wilderness. As the fire continues to flicker and the wind howls outside, you know that tomorrow will bring more of the same. The cold will return, the struggle for warmth will continue, but for now, there's a strange comfort in knowing that you've made it through another night. The shelter, the warmth of the fire, and the companionship of those around you are enough to carry you through. The cold will always be there, but so will the resilience to face it. The first light of morning spills across the horizon, a soft, pale blue that promises the arrival of a new day. But the cold doesn't relent. The frost still clings to the edges of your shelter, and the warmth of the fire, though briefly comforting, fades into nothingness as the morning air rushes in. You feel the cold bite at your exposed skin, and despite your thick layers, the chill seems to get under them, through every crevice and gap. The wilderness, in its brutal beauty, waits outside quiet, unmoving, and unrelenting. Yet there's a sense of routine to the harshness of it all. Each day, you wake up to the same struggle: the cold, the silence, the long hours of labor, and the ever-present awareness that survival is never guaranteed. But you've learned over time that this is the rhythm of life in the wilderness. It's exhausting, but it's also something you can lean into. The fire needs stoking, the shelter needs checking, the firewood needs replenishing, tasks that have become second nature, a necessary part of your daily existence. One of the key aspects of medieval survival in the wilderness was the routine. The repetitive nature of life, while monotonous, served as an anchor. The actions you take, gathering firewood, checking on the fire, hunting for food, maintaining your shelter, are survival rituals. Though each action seems simple and small in itself, together they form the foundation of your day, a way to focus your mind and energy on the task at hand. The cold may be unyielding, but the certainty of these routines provides a small sense of control in a world where so much is uncertain. Historians still discuss the impact of routine on medieval communities during the long winters. Some argue that the routines were a form of mental resilience, a way to stay grounded and avoid the crushing effects of isolation and despair. Others point to the fact that these routines often served as a means of maintaining social order, ensuring that everyone in the community had a role to play in the collective struggle for survival. Regardless of the reasons, the structure provided by daily tasks was essential for survival. It kept people focused, connected, and motivated even in the worst of times. But despite the comfort of routine, it's hard not to feel the weight of the isolation. The stillness of the wilderness, the distant howl of wolves, and the unbroken silence between the shelter walls can make it feel like the world outside is vast, empty, and indifferent to your struggle. The absence of others, especially in the cold of winter, can make it easy to feel alone. Even with companions around you, the lack of communication, the absence of external distractions, makes the silence deafening. A quirky aspect of medieval winter life is that the sense of isolation was often mitigated by the warmth of the communal hearth. The hearth, central to the home, was not just a source of heat, it was a symbol of unity. Families, neighbors, and even strangers would gather around the fire, sharing stories, food, and warmth. Despite the harsh conditions, the communal gathering around the hearth was a vital part of maintaining social bonds. It was here, around the flickering flames, that people found comfort, shared news, and built relationships. The hearth served as a place of connection, where the chill of the outside world was momentarily forgotten and the warmth of human companionship took center stage. Even though you might spend the days in isolation, the fire at night offers the chance to reconnect with those around you. It's more than just warmth, it's the quiet moments of shared understanding, of shared experience. You might not speak much, but the presence of others, their warmth, their shared vigilance against the cold, is a comfort. It reminds you that, despite the cold, you are not truly alone in the world. The flickering shadows of the fire cast on the walls of the shelter tell the stories of everyone who huddles around it. Silent stories of endurance, of shared hardship, and of survival. Historians often note how the medieval winter months, though incredibly difficult, also brought people together. The need for cooperation, for shared warmth, for collective survival meant that bonds were forged not just through the physical act of surviving, but through the rituals and shared experiences of winter life. The days were filled with work, but the nights were filled with moments of connection, of shared rest and shared warmth. The cold might have kept people from venturing far from their homes, but it also forced them to depend on one another in ways that might not have been necessary in warmer months. It was in these moments of shared warmth that the true strength of medieval communities was found. But even with the comfort of companionship, the struggle for warmth and survival never truly ends. Each day is just another iteration of the same fight, a fight against the cold, against the wilderness, and against the uncertainty of life itself. The cold has a way of making everything seem sharper, more immediate. Every movement becomes more deliberate, every breath more precious. One particularly notable aspect of medieval life in the wilderness was the physical toll of surviving the cold. The constant exposure to freezing temperatures, even with layers of clothing and animal skins, could wear the body down. In particular, the feet and hands were most vulnerable. Walking through deep snow or trudging through frozen terrain could cause frostbite, blisters, and fatigue. Despite the resilience of medieval people, their bodies were not invincible. And yet, they kept moving, kept working, and kept surviving. Their bodies, though often weakened by the harsh conditions, were a testament to human endurance. A well-known fact is that medieval winters had a significant impact on life expectancy. The extreme cold, combined with the physical exertion required to survive, led to shorter lifespans. People who lived through these winters often died young, victims of the cold, the hunger, or the diseases that thrived in such conditions. But those who did survive, who made it through each long winter, had a resilience that is difficult to comprehend from the comfort of modern life. Their ability to endure, to keep going despite the odds, is a reminder of the strength of the human spirit. As you lie there, the fire flickering and the cold creeping in once again, you realize that this cycle will continue. Each day will bring more labor, more isolation, and more cold. But for now, you have the warmth of the fire, the presence of your companions, and the knowledge that you've made it through another night. The cold may be relentless, but so is your resolve. You have survived the night, and tomorrow you will rise again to face the next day of struggle, survival, and endurance. As the night stretches on and the fire slowly dies down, you feel the familiar bite of the cold creeping back into your bones. The wind outside has grown stronger, howling against the shelter's walls, reminding you that the wilderness doesn't rest. There's no sense of comfort, only the quiet persistence of survival. You tug the furs tighter around your body, trying to find some respite from the relentless cold, but sleep seems far off. The rhythmic pulse of your own shivering, the occasional crackle from the fire, and the unsettling noises outside, perhaps a creature stirring in the snow, keep your mind alert. The night has always been the hardest part of survival. It's during these long hours, in the dark and cold, that every ounce of your strength feels stretched thin. You're not just trying to sleep, you're trying to survive the night, to make it to the next day. It's a strange paradox. Sleep is necessary for the body's recovery, but the environment is hostile, keeping you from resting deeply. You know that, in the morning, there will be more work gathering firewood, perhaps hunting, repairing the shelter, but for now, you face the cold, alone with your thoughts. The medieval people of the wilderness, much like you, would have faced these same battles each night. The cold was always there, a relentless force that seemed impossible to escape, but they learned to adapt, to live with the discomfort, and to make the best of the situation. Sleep was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. They didn't have the comfort of modern heating, or the warmth of thick mattresses, or even proper bedding. Instead, they used what they had: animal furs, straw, hay, whatever they could find to try and keep themselves warm enough to sleep. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people often slept in shifts, particularly during the winter months. This segmented sleep was a necessary adaptation to the conditions. People didn't sleep for long stretches like we do today. Instead, they would sleep in short bursts, waking in the middle of the night to stoke the fire, check on the shelter, or simply ensure that no danger was approaching. It's believed that this pattern of sleep was common, particularly in the wilderness, where vigilance was essential. The cold and the constant threats from the environment and wildlife meant that a continuous, undisturbed night of rest was a rare luxury. Even when they could sleep, they were always ready to wake at a moment's notice. Historians still debate how these segmented sleep patterns affected people's health and productivity. Some suggest that these shorter sleep intervals help to keep the body more alert, especially in dangerous environments. Others argue that this pattern of fragmented sleep could have led to exhaustion, with individuals never truly getting the deep, restorative rest they needed. Either way, it's clear that sleep in the medieval wilderness was never restful in the way we think of it today. It was a survival tactic, an adaptation to the constant pressures of the environment. One of the lesser-known aspects of medieval life in the wilderness was the sense of collective resilience. People didn't just rely on their own strength to survive the cold, they relied on each other. While it's true that medieval people lived in close quarters, often sharing small shelters, this proximity was not just about warmth, it was also about emotional survival. The shared struggle against the elements, the daily fight for warmth, and the bond created by communal living made the hardships more bearable. In some ways, the warmth from the bodies of those around you was just as vital as the warmth from the fire. A quirky tidbit from history reveals that people in medieval times often used small community gatherings as a way to alleviate the mental toll of the cold. Even in isolated villages or wilderness settlements, gatherings around the fire could serve as both a source of warmth and a social lifeline. People would share stories, jokes, songs, and even legends. In some areas, it was common to bring the livestock inside the shelter during the coldest months, further fostering a sense of closeness and camaraderie. These gatherings were not just about survival, they were about maintaining the emotional and mental health necessary to endure the long, dark winters. Scholars still debate how much of medieval social structure was defined by these communal moments. Some argue that the reliance on communal living during the harsh winters shaped the close-knit nature of medieval society. Others suggest that the isolation of winter, particularly in more remote areas, created a sense of personal autonomy, where each individual's survival depended on their own efforts, and that social bonds were secondary. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, as both elements played a role in the survival and mental well-being of medieval people. Despite these bonds, the wilderness could still be a deeply lonely place. The isolation wasn't always physical, sometimes it was mental. The stillness of the night, the never-ending cold, the lack of company, it all added up to a sense of emptiness that was hard to escape. Even if you were surrounded by people, it was easy to feel alone. The cold had a way of making you feel distant, disconnected from the world. It reminded you of how fragile life could be. One harsh winter, one ill-prepared shelter, and it could all be over. But as you lie in the shelter, shivering under the firs, the fire dying slowly in the corner, you know that you are not alone. You are connected to something bigger, the community around you, the shared struggle, the legacy of those who came before. You may be cold, you may be tired, but you are alive. And tomorrow, you will face another day, another battle with the wilderness. But for now, as you lie in the warmth of the firelight, you know that you have made it through another night. That's something to hold on to. A significant aspect of survival in the medieval wilderness was understanding the limits of human endurance. It wasn't about conquering the cold, about overcoming the wilderness, it was about finding ways to live with it. The struggle was constant, but so was the resilience. It was this adaptability, this quiet determination to endure, that allowed people to survive in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. The cold will still be there. The wilderness will remain a daunting, unforgiving place. But as you close your eyes, exhausted from the long hours of work and the struggle against the elements, you know one thing: you have survived. And that, in the end, is what matters most. The fire crackles softly, casting a faint, comforting glow across the shelter. Outside, the wind picks up, howling through the trees, but inside, it's quiet for the moment. You pull the furs tighter around your body, settling in for another restless night. The fire, though small, offers a fragile warmth. Every now and then a gust of wind slams against the walls, but the shelter holds firm for now. The rhythmic sound of your own breathing, the crackling of the fire, and the ever-present chill outside create a strange sense of stillness, a suspended moment in time. The wilderness, so vast and unforgiving, can make the nights feel endless. You try to sleep, but it's hard to escape the awareness of the cold that surrounds you, creeping into the corners of your mind as much as it does your body. The harshness of the wilderness doesn't relent, it's a constant companion, a reminder that every day is a battle to survive. Even as the fire burns, you know it can never truly chase away the cold. It only pushes it back for a time, holding it at bay until the morning. A significant aspect of medieval life in the wilderness was the way people adapted to the constant discomfort of the cold. It wasn't just about enduring it, it was about learning to live with it, to work around it. Medieval people were resourceful, finding ways to make the best of the harshest conditions. They used what was available: animal skins, wool, straw, and whatever else they could find to create warmth. But even with all these tools, the cold was never fully conquered. It was simply managed. Historians still debate the psychological impact of these relentless winters. Some argue that the cold hardened medieval people, making them more resilient and mentally tough. Others suggest that the constant battle with the elements took a heavy toll, both physically and mentally. The isolation, the constant vigilance against danger, the never-ending effort to stay warm, all of these contributed to a life that was far from restful. But despite the toll, medieval people found ways to survive. They adapted, they endured, and they did so together. The communal aspect of winter survival was crucial. You could not endure the cold alone, not just because of the physical demands, but because of the emotional strain. The cold had a way of isolating you, not just from the outside world, but also from yourself. It numbed the mind as much as the body. But when you shared the struggle, when you huddled together by the fire with family and friends, the burden was lighter. The warmth of others, the shared experience of survival, gave people the strength to keep going. The fire, small as it was the center of it all. It was not just a source of warmth, but a symbol of life, a beacon in the otherwise dark and cold world. A lesser-known fact about medieval shelters is that some communities used the very earth around them as part of their shelter construction. Dugouts, which were often used in rural areas, were built into hillsides or the ground itself. These earthen homes helped to insulate against the cold, utilizing the earth's natural thermal properties to keep the interior somewhat warmer. The structure was simple walls made of packed earth, with a thatched roof and a small entrance. While these homes were far from luxurious, they were effective. And yet, even with the earth's natural insulation, the cold would still press in. The wind could still find its way through the cracks, and the fire could only do so much. Still, the use of the earth as a building material was a testament to the resourcefulness of medieval people. Scholars still debate how widespread the use of dugouts and other earthen homes was during medieval times. Some argue that they were more common in colder climates, where the earth's insulating properties would have been a significant advantage. Others suggest that these types of homes were reserved for the lower classes, who couldn't afford the materials or labor required to build more conventional houses. Either way, it's clear that medieval people used the natural environment to their advantage, making the most of what they had to create shelters that could withstand the brutal cold. The nights in the wilderness, especially during winter, had a rhythm all their own. They were long and slow, marked by the passing of time in the small repetitive actions: stoking the fire, adjusting the furs, checking for any sign of danger. The isolation and the cold were always present, but there was a strange sense of comfort in the rituals of survival. Despite the discomfort, there was something grounding about it all. The simplicity of life, the focus on just surviving each day, brought a kind of clarity. There were no distractions, no worries beyond the immediate needs of warmth, food, and safety. Life, in its most basic form, had a rhythm. A quirky tidbit that many historians bring up is that medieval people didn't necessarily sleep in complete silence. It wasn't uncommon for families to engage in light conversation, share stories, or even sing by the fire before going to bed. These shared moments of connection, even during the harshest conditions, helped to maintain a sense of normalcy. The firelight, the quiet voices, and the warmth of shared company made the isolation of the wilderness a little less daunting. This sense of community, of togetherness, was not just practical, it was essential for mental and emotional survival. As you lie there, the night dragging on, you can't help but think of how much has been passed down from these medieval survival practices. The importance of fire, of shared warmth, of communal living, all of these things echo in the way we approach survival today. Modern conveniences have changed much of how we live, but the core needs of human survival remain the same: warmth, shelter, food, and companionship. You are, in many ways, a part of this long history of resilience, of learning to adapt to the harshness of the world and finding ways to survive. The fire is burning low, and the night continues. You shift beneath the furs, trying to find some semblance of comfort, and as the minutes drag on, you realize that survival, at its core, is about accepting the discomfort. It's about enduring, about finding the will to keep going, no matter how difficult or painful the conditions may be. Tomorrow will come, and with it, more tasks, more struggle, and more cold. But for now, in this moment, you have made it through another night. The first light of dawn creeps into the shelter, casting a faint, silvery glow over the frost-covered walls. The wind still howls outside, but inside, there's a fragile warmth in the air, a reminder that the cycle of survival continues. You stretch out your stiff limbs beneath the heavy layers of furs, your body aching from the cold, the restless sleep, and the long hours spent trying to find comfort in the chill. The fire is just a smouldering remnant now, its warmth barely enough to ward off the early morning cold. You know you have to rise, there's work to be done, and the day can't wait. As you step outside, the snow crunches beneath your boots, and the cold rushes in, biting at your face and hands. The wilderness is still, frozen in time, yet every inch of the landscape demands your attention. The trees, heavy with snow, seem to watch over you in silence. The wind, ever present, cuts through the air with a relentless edge. The world, beautiful in its starkness, is also merciless in its coldness. The battle for warmth is never truly won. Each day is another fight to survive, to gather enough firewood, to protect yourself from the biting chill, to make sure the shelter holds through another night. A widely accepted historical truth is that medieval people were incredibly resourceful in finding ways to survive the harsh winters. From fashioning clothing out of animal skins and furs to creating shelters that could withstand the cold, every aspect of their lives was shaped by the need to keep warm. Yet, despite all this ingenuity, survival was never guaranteed. The cold, with its insistent bite, never relented. It was a constant, unyielding force that tested the limits of human endurance. And for the people who lived through it, the ability to endure the winter months became a matter of life and death. But medieval people didn't just survive, they adapted. The strategies they employed, from communal living to the creative use of natural resources, were key to making it through the brutal winters. The fact that people survived at all during these harsh conditions speaks to the strength of human resilience, the ability to make do with what little was available, and the sheer determination to keep going, no matter the odds. A quirky tidbit from history is that medieval people often built their homes with multiple layers of materials to insulate against the cold. In addition to thick walls made of stone or timber, some shelters had an additional layer of wattle and daub, or even moss packed into the walls to act as insulation. This practice wasn't always foolproof, but it was a way of increasing the chance of maintaining some semblance of warmth in the coldest months. Yet, despite these measures, there was no way to fully block out the cold. The fire remained a lifeline, but even firewood was scarce, and you couldn't always guarantee it would last through the night. The constant need to maintain warmth in these conditions led to the development of what we might consider primitive forms of heating. Beyond the central hearth, some medieval homes had small portable stoves or braziers, often filled with hot coals or stones. These devices helped to provide some localized warmth, especially in the larger rooms of the home, and were particularly useful in larger shelters where a single fire might not be enough to warm everyone. Even with these innovations, however, the cold was a formidable enemy, and people often had to layer up with multiple garments, including thick woolen tunics, leggings, and cloaks made from animal furs, to keep warm. As you begin to move through the snow, the day's tasks loom before you. The firewood must be gathered, the shelter checked for any weak spots, and food must be prepared. Even with all the work that lies ahead, there's a strange comfort in the familiarity of the routine. The same tasks, the same struggle, and the same cold. All of it becomes a rhythm that you learn to move with, as though survival itself has a pattern, a quiet dance that is both exhausting and grounding. One of the more established facts about medieval life in the wilderness is that survival during the winter months required constant vigilance. People had to stay alert to the shifting winds, the coming of storms, and the changing behavior of the wildlife. The cold made hunting harder, and food had to be carefully rationed. People would often preserve food in various ways, salting, drying, or smoking meat to ensure they had enough to get through the winter months. This constant need to prepare, to plan, to ensure that resources were available was part of the survival strategy. The food you gathered in the warmer months had to last, and it often did not. The cold would spoil fresh food quickly, and the frozen ground made it harder to hunt and forage for new sources of sustenance. The struggle for food, like the battle against the cold, was constant. Despite these hardships, the medieval people found ways to thrive. They developed sophisticated methods for living with the land, using it to their advantage while also working in harmony with it. Communities formed around these shared struggles, each person contributing to the collective effort. The need for cooperation became essential. Survival was a team effort. Whether it was sharing food, firewood, or shelter, the idea of community was vital. People knew that they could not make it alone. And so, they learned to live together, to support one another, even in the harshest of winters. Scholars still debate how much of medieval life was shaped by this need for cooperation. Some believe that medieval people were more individualistic, with the focus on family units rather than communal living. Others argue that the struggle for survival was so great that it forced people to come together, sharing resources and responsibilities in ways that fostered close-knit communities. What is clear, however, is that medieval survival depended heavily on the ability of individuals to work together, to support each other, and to rely on the strength of the group to weather the storm. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the community was the foundation of survival. As the sun rises higher in the sky, the cold remains unrelenting. The struggle for warmth and sustenance continues. Yet there is something deeply grounding in the routine, in the knowledge that despite the cold and the hardships, you are alive, you are resilient. And as long as the fire keeps burning, and as long as the community around you remains strong, survival is possible. Today, like those who lived through medieval winters, you face your own struggles. Perhaps not with the same cold, the same isolation, or the same dangers, but the rhythm of life remains the same. The constant fight for warmth, for security, for survival, it is an ancient struggle, one that unites us all, from the medieval wilderness to the modern world. As the day progresses, the bite of the cold remains persistent. The sun, though rising higher in the sky, does little to dispel the frost that clings to the ground and the trees. You can feel the weight of the cold in every step you take, in every breath that burns your lungs. The task before you is clear: gather wood, check the shelter, ensure the fire stays strong. The chores of survival are not glamorous, but they are necessary. Each task, no matter how small, is part of the fragile web that holds your survival together. The fire, though low, is a small comfort. It crackles and pops, sending a faint warmth into the cold air. but you know it won't last without constant attention. The fire is not only a means of survival, it is a symbol. It is the heartbeat of your shelter, the one thing that stands between you and the unyielding wilderness. Without it, the cold would quickly reclaim the space around you, creeping into every corner of the shelter, numbing your limbs, stealing your warmth. So, you stoke the fire carefully, adding small logs, keeping it alive. The crackle of the flames is a quiet reassurance, but it will take only a few hours before the embers die down again and the process must begin anew. One of the central, widely recognized truths about medieval survival was the reliance on fire. Fire was the primary source of warmth, light, and safety. Without it, survival in the wilderness would have been nearly impossible. Yet, despite its importance, fire was a fragile thing. It could be easily extinguished by the elements, and it required constant maintenance. Gathering firewood wasn't just a task, it was an essential ritual that allowed people to feel like they had control over their environment, even if only for a fleeting moment. Medieval people had to be skilled in building fires, knowing what wood would burn best, how to protect the flame from the wind, and how to keep it going through the night. This knowledge was passed down through generations, a vital skill for anyone living in the wilderness. But fire was just one part of the equation. It was also crucial to keep the shelter itself protected from the cold. Medieval homes, particularly those in rural or wilderness areas, were often built with thick walls made of timber, stone, or packed earth. While these structures offered some defense against the cold, they were not impervious to the elements. Over time, the cold would seep in through the cracks, through gaps in the roof, or through the walls themselves. To combat this, people would often use animal skins, blankets, and even moss to insulate the shelter. This use of natural materials for insulation is a testament to the resourcefulness of medieval people. They didn't have access to modern construction materials, but they made do with what the environment offered. And yet, even with all these efforts, the cold remained a constant threat. It was always lurking, just beyond the warmth of the fire. A quirky tidbit of history reveals that medieval people often adapted their sleeping positions to better retain body heat. Rather than sleeping flat on the ground, they would sleep in a curled position, often huddled together with other family members or companions. This strategy, known as sleeping in the spoon, helped conserve warmth by minimizing the surface area exposed to the cold. People would huddle close together, relying on the shared body heat to keep them warm through the night. In some cases, animals, particularly dogs, were also brought inside the shelter, adding another layer of warmth. While this might not have been the most comfortable sleeping arrangement, it was a necessary one in order to survive the cold. As historians often point out, survival in the medieval wilderness wasn't just about physical endurance, it was also about mental toughness. The isolation, the relentless cold, and the constant danger of predators or rivals could wear down even the most resilient person. Yet, medieval people found ways to cope with these stresses. One method was through shared activities like storytelling. After a long day spent working in the cold, families or communities would gather around the fire and share stories. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were a way to bond, to distract from the hardships of daily life, and to pass down wisdom and traditions. The warmth of the fire, the shared company, and the comforting rhythm of familiar stories were a way to ease the tension of living in such a harsh environment. Scholars still debate the role of storytelling in medieval communities. Some suggest that it was purely a means of entertainment and escapism, a way to forget the harsh realities of the world. Others believe that these stories were more practical, serving as a way to pass on important survival knowledge, as well as cultural values. The truth is likely a blend of both. Storytelling provided not only comfort, but also a way to keep the community connected, to ensure that knowledge was passed down, and to remind everyone of their shared humanity in the face of the wilderness. It was a ritual that helped people feel less isolated, even in the most difficult times. As the day wears on, you continue your work, your thoughts drifting between the present task and the weight of the night ahead. The cold will return with the setting sun, and the shelter, however well prepared, will be tested once again. But there is a quiet satisfaction in the work. Each task, each movement, each moment of survival builds upon the last. You have become part of this rhythm, this cycle of struggle and endurance. And though the cold is always there is also the knowledge that you are not alone in it. Tomorrow will bring more of the same. The cold will remain, the fire will need stoking, and the shelter will require maintenance. The days are long, and the nights are endless. But with each sunrise, you are reminded of the strength of human resilience. You are reminded that, despite the harshness of the world, there is always warmth to be found, whether in the fire, in the community around you, or in the simple knowledge that you have made it through another day. The days blur into one another, a cycle of work, cold, and fleeting moments of warmth. As the sun sets once again, the fire is stoked and the shelter is checked. Each task feels like a small victory, a reassurance that you're doing everything you can to survive. The cold is relentless, but so are you. Even as you settle in for the night, with the fire flickering dimly in the corner, you know that tomorrow will bring the same struggles. Gathering firewood, stoking the flames, checking the shelter, staying alert for signs of danger. It's exhausting, but it's the rhythm of survival, the unspoken rule that has governed your existence since the first frost. The night settles around you, quiet and still, save for the occasional howl of wolves in the distance and the occasional crack of the fire. The cold presses in from every angle, but the warmth of the fire offers some comfort. It's not enough to completely chase away the chill, but it's enough to make the night bearable. You huddle closer to the warmth, feeling the fire's heat through the furs and wool. The world outside may be frozen, but inside the shelter, there's a fragile sense of safety. A commonly accepted fact is that fire wasn't just a source of warmth during the medieval winters. It was also a symbol of hope. In a world where the cold could kill, the fire was a constant reminder that, for another day, you had survived. It was more than just an element. It was a lifeline, something you could rely on when everything else seemed uncertain. The act of maintaining the fire, of keeping it burning through the night, became a ritual of survival. It was a simple act, yet it held great significance. It was about more than just warmth, it was about endurance, about the will to survive another night in the wilderness. But even as the fire burns, you know it won't last forever. Eventually, it will die down, and the cold will creep back in. The fire is fleeting, just like the moments of comfort it offers. In a sense, the fire becomes a symbol of the struggle itself. The warmth it provides is temporary, but the fight to keep it burning is constant. It's a reminder that survival is never guaranteed, it's a continuous battle, one that requires constant effort, constant vigilance, and constant resilience. One of the more intriguing aspects of medieval life in the wilderness was the concept of segmented sleep. The cold, the danger, and the constant need for vigilance meant that a full, uninterrupted night of sleep was a luxury that few could afford. Instead, people often slept in shifts, waking up throughout the night to tend to the fire, to check on the shelter, or to stay alert for any signs of danger. This fragmented sleep cycle was a necessary adaptation to the harsh conditions of the medieval wilderness. People had to be constantly prepared, always ready to act if needed. Sleep wasn't just about rest, it was about survival. Each sleep cycle was broken up, leaving people awake and alert, always aware of the cold that could slip in at any moment. Historians still debate how segmented sleep affected medieval people's health and overall well-being. Some suggest that the constant wakefulness may have been physically draining, leading to exhaustion and mental fatigue. Others believe that it was simply a matter of adapting to the environment, something that became second nature. Regardless, it's clear that sleep in the medieval wilderness was not a simple, uninterrupted escape. It was a carefully managed process, one that balanced the need for rest with the need for survival. People would have learned to function on less sleep, their bodies and minds becoming accustomed to the cycle of waking and sleeping in shorter bursts. The cold was a constant companion, never truly leaving but always pushing you to adapt. And through it all, you continued gathering wood, stoking the fire, and finding ways to keep warm. The medieval people were survivors, not because they were stronger or more resilient than us, but because they learned to work with the land, to adapt to the harshness of their environment. They understood that survival wasn't about brute strength, it was about resourcefulness, about knowing how to make do with what you had. It was about understanding that the elements were always a threat, but also that there were ways to protect yourself, to stay warm, to stay alive. A quirky fact about medieval survival is that some people believed the cold itself had a spirit. In certain regions, people would leave offerings of food or firewood outside their homes, hoping to appease the spirit of the winter cold. It's a strange concept, but it reflects the medieval belief that the natural world was full of unseen forces, forces that could help or hinder your survival. This belief in the power of nature was something medieval people had to contend with, just as they had to contend with the physical dangers of the wilderness. The cold was not just something you fought against, it was something you respected, something you learned to live with, much like the rest of the world around you. As you lie beneath the firs, the fire beginning to flicker low, you reflect on the days that have passed. The nights spent shivering in the cold, the days spent gathering firewood and preparing for the next cycle of survival. Each task, each action, brings you one step closer to another day. Tomorrow will be another battle against the elements, another chance to prove your resilience. And despite the challenges, despite the cold, you find strength in the rhythm of the day. You've survived the night, and for now, that is enough. Survival in the medieval wilderness wasn't about conquering nature, it was about understanding it. It was about learning to live with it, to work around it, to make the most of what you had. The cold, the darkness, and the isolation were all part of the world medieval people inhabited, and through it all they found ways to endure, to adapt, and to keep moving forward. The struggle never ended, but neither did their will to survive. Another day has come, bringing with it the same cold, the same struggles, and the same need to survive. The early morning is still, with the air crisp and biting. The frost on the ground crunches underfoot as you step out of the shelter, feeling the chill seep into your bones. You can see your breath hang in the air like a cloud, the icy fingers of winter reaching out to greet you. The world outside is a frozen landscape, untouched, silent save for the occasional whistle of the wind. The sun, low and weak, struggles to break through the haze of the sky. But no matter how faint the sunlight, it offers a glimmer of hope, a reminder that the world is still turning, even if it feels like everything around you is frozen in place. You know that today, like every other day, the battle for survival will continue. There are tasks to be done gathering firewood, hunting for food, checking the shelter for any signs of damage. The cold will persist, and so must you. But as you move through the wilderness, there's a quiet understanding that this is life now, a constant cycle of work, struggle, and endurance. The cold will never fully leave, but you can push it back, just enough to survive. Just enough to make it through another day. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people, especially those living in the wilderness, became experts at making do with whatever they had. They didn't have the luxury of modern tools or the comforts we take for granted today, but they developed skills that allowed them to survive in the harshest of conditions. One of the most essential of these skills was the ability to make and maintain a fire. From the earliest days of civilization, fire was crucial not only for warmth and cooking, but for survival itself. The fire was the center of life, the key to making it through the night. Keeping it alive was no small task. It required constant attention, careful gathering of firewood, and knowledge of how to protect the flame from the wind. Yet even with all the effort spent on maintaining the fire, the cold was never fully kept at bay. The fire could only do so much. It could warm you, give you light, and offer comfort, but it couldn't change the fact that the wilderness was harsh and unyielding. Medieval people knew this well. They understood that they were living in a world where comfort was a rare commodity, where survival itself was a victory, and where the cold was always waiting to reclaim its ground. But they learned how to adapt, how to live with the cold, and how to make the best of what they had. A quirky tidbit of history reveals that medieval people often used the very earth beneath them to help protect themselves from the cold. One of the most ingenious techniques was the practice of digging into the ground, creating a deeper, earth-covered shelter to provide some insulation against the freezing temperatures. These dugouts, as they were known, were often used by those who lived in rural or isolated areas. They would dig into the earth to create a space that was partially underground, providing some protection from the wind and cold. The earth, while not a perfect insulator, helped to keep the interior warmer than above-ground structures could. The people who lived in these homes didn't have modern insulation, but they made use of the natural world around them, just as medieval people always had. Historians still debate how widespread the use of dugouts was, but it is clear that these earth-based homes were an important part of medieval survival strategies. The cold of the winter would seep into the air, into the bones, into the very fabric of daily life. But the use of the earth, whether as a shelter or as a source of warmth, was a reminder that even in the harshest environments, people could make use of what they had. The cold may have been unrelenting, but the ingenuity and resourcefulness of those who lived in the wilderness allowed them to survive. But survival was never simple. Each night, as you huddle under the furs and try to find some comfort, you know that the cold will return with the dawn. The fire, though carefully tended, is never enough to keep the chill from creeping in. You try to rest, but sleep comes only in fits, interrupted by the awareness of the cold, the distant sounds of the wilderness, and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more of the same. Despite the discomfort, there is a strange comfort in the rhythm of survival. The tasks that must be done, the fire that must be stoked, the shelter that must be maintained, they all become a part of the landscape, a constant thread that ties each day together. The cold may be a persistent enemy, but it also becomes something that shapes your life. It's a force that you must learn to live with, to respect, and to adapt to. It's a reminder that survival is not about fighting the elements, it's about finding ways to coexist with them. Scholars continue to explore how medieval people coped with the cold and isolation. Some argue that the extreme conditions led to a kind of resilience. People grew stronger and more resourceful in the face of adversity. Others suggest that the cold contributed to the mental and physical toll that shortened lifespans in medieval times. There's no easy answer, but one thing is clear: the battle against the cold was never just a physical struggle. It was a mental and emotional challenge as well, a test of endurance that stretched far beyond the need for warmth. As the day wears on, you continue with your work, gathering firewood, checking the shelter, securing food. The cold, as always, presses in. But there's a quiet satisfaction in the work, a recognition that with each task completed, you are that much closer to the next day of survival. The wilderness, in all its beauty and danger, is a place that demands resilience. It requires you to be adaptable, to be resourceful, and to never stop moving forward. It's not about conquering the elements, but about living with them. And as you continue through the day, gathering what you need to survive, you know that you will face the same struggle again tomorrow. Tomorrow, the cold will return. The tasks will be the same. But for now, you have made it through another day, another night, and that is enough. The sun is setting once again, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The sky, now tinged with hues of pink and purple, offers a brief respite from the harshness of the day. But as the daylight fades, the cold rises, sweeping through the wilderness with a fresh intensity. The wind picks up, howling through the trees, making the night feel even longer. You settle back into your shelter, the familiar weight of the furs wrapping around you. The fire, though still burning, is weak, the embers crackling quietly in the corner. The warmth it provides is fleeting, but it is enough for now. The cycle of the day has come full circle. The work is done, the fire stoked, and the shelter checked. There's nothing left to do but wait for the night to pass, to survive until morning. The cold, as always, presses in, creeping through the gaps in the shelter, testing your resolve. But tonight, like every night before, you have your fire, your shelter, and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more of the same. A widely recognized truth in medieval survival is that the long, cold nights were just as taxing on the mind as they were on the body. The isolation, the stillness, the relentless chill, it all added up, taking a toll that went beyond physical exhaustion. Medieval people often lived in small, close-knit communities, but the wilderness, with its isolation and harshness, could still feel incredibly lonely. The cold made it harder to connect with others, and the constant vigilance needed for survival left little room for rest. And so, as the night stretches on, you find yourself drifting between wakefulness and sleep, caught in the rhythm of survival. In the silence of the night, the crackling of the fire is a small comfort, but even the warmth of the flames can't erase the weight of the cold, the loneliness of the wilderness. The wind outside howls, and you know that at any moment, the shelter may be tested once again. But for now, the fire is enough. It provides a brief moment of peace in an otherwise unforgiving world. And as you lay there, wrapped in the furs, you can't help but reflect on how survival itself has become a kind of ritual. Each day is a new challenge, but it is also a reminder of your resilience. One of the interesting aspects of medieval life in the wilderness was the role of mental resilience. The physical struggle for warmth and food was only half the battle. The mental toll of living through long, cold winters was just as significant. People had to find ways to cope with the isolation, the fear, and the monotony. Storytelling, community gatherings, and shared rituals around the fire were just a few of the ways medieval people kept their spirits alive. But even with these coping mechanisms, the mental strain of survival was a constant presence. It wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about maintaining the will to keep going, even when everything around you seemed bleak. Historians continue to explore how medieval people maintained their mental and emotional well-being during these long winters. Some suggest that the harsh conditions forced people to rely on each other more than ever, creating bonds of solidarity that helped them endure. Others believe that the struggle for survival led to a kind of resignation, a quiet acceptance of the hardships that came with living in such a brutal environment. Either way, it's clear that survival wasn't just a matter of physical endurance, it was also a matter of psychological strength. A quirky historical tidbit reveals that some medieval communities had specific rituals or practices designed to help them cope with the mental toll of the winter months. One such ritual was the celebration of midwinter, a feast held during the longest night of the year. This celebration, which often involved food, drink, and communal gatherings, was seen as a way to mark the passing of the darkest days and to bring some light into the long, cold nights. It was a time for people to come together, to share warmth and stories, and to remind themselves that even in the coldest months, there was still community, still life, still hope. Scholars still debate the true significance of these midwinter celebrations. Some believe they were purely a religious observance, marking the winter solstice and the return of the light. Others suggest that they were simply a way to keep spirits high during a difficult time of year, a way to break up the monotony of the winter months. Regardless of their origins, these celebrations served an important purpose. They reminded people that the cold would eventually end, that spring would come, and that they could survive until then. As you lay there, the fire flickering and the cold creeping back in, you can't help but think of the midwinter celebrations. The warmth of the fire, the camaraderie of those around you, the shared rituals, these small moments of connection are the things that make survival possible. They are the threads that hold everything together. Even in the harshest conditions, even in the coldest nights, there is still warmth to be found in the fire, in the community, in the knowledge that you are not alone. The cycle continues. The cold will return, the tasks will remain the same, and the struggle will continue. But in this moment, under the flickering firelight, there is peace. The cold may press in, but you know that you will survive. You've made it through another night, and tomorrow you will rise again to face another day. The fire will burn, the shelter will stand, and the cycle of survival will begin once more. The first pale light of dawn pushes through the cracks in your shelter, casting soft shadows across the frost-covered ground. The air inside is cold, and you can feel the chill seeping through your furs. Yet, there's something about the early morning light that brings a sense of quiet relief, as if the worst of the cold has passed for now. You stretch out, stiff and sore beneath the weight of the blankets and furs. The warmth from the fire, which was once comforting, has long since dwindled to nothing but embers. But there's no time to dwell on it. The day must begin. As you rise and begin your morning routine gathering firewood, checking the shelter, and preparing for the work ahead, you're reminded of the resilience it takes to make it through another day. You know that it's the same as every other day. Survival requires relentless effort. Each task, from stoking the fire to gathering food, is part of the struggle against the cold that defines your life. And though the cold never truly leaves, there's comfort in the familiar rhythm of it all. Every small victory, whether it's the crackle of the fire, the warmth of the hearth, or simply finding a few more logs to burn, is enough to get you through. A well-established historical fact is that medieval people had to be endlessly resourceful to survive the harsh winters. They made use of whatever was at hand, whether that be firewood, animal furs, or the very earth itself, to create warmth and shelter. Every scrap of wood was gathered and stored for the long months ahead. The fire, though fragile and fleeting, became the heart of the home, its glow providing not just warmth, but a sense of security in a world that offered little comfort. But despite the ingenuity that went into these efforts, the reality was that the cold was always a looming threat. The shelter, no matter how well built, could never be fully insulated against the cold. The fire, though stoked and cared for, would always die down in the night, leaving the cold to creep in. Even the thickest animal skins could not completely block the chill. Yet, these small efforts, gathering, building, maintaining, were what allowed people to survive. They didn't conquer the cold, they lived with it. Historians still argue about the methods medieval people used to preserve warmth in their shelters. Some suggest that the most effective approach was communal living. People huddled together at night, sharing body heat, huddling close to the fire for warmth. It wasn't uncommon for several families or individuals to share a single, small shelter, all sleeping in close proximity. This tight-knit communal living wasn't just a practical strategy for warmth, it helped maintain a sense of safety and comfort in an otherwise perilous world. The shared warmth of bodies, the comfort of shared company, provided not only physical warmth, but emotional solace as well. But even with the shared warmth of family or community, the nights were often long, and sleep was never easy. The cold, the vigilance, the danger it all wore on you. When you closed your eyes, the fear of predators or the cold creeping in was always there. Every shift in the shelter, every crack in the walls, every whisper of wind made it clear that safety was never guaranteed. But somehow, in the midst of all this, sleep would come restless, fragmented, and always interrupted by the demands of survival. A quirky little historical tidbit is that medieval people often adapted their sleep patterns to the challenges of winter. In some areas, people would sleep in 2 shifts, with family members or companions waking throughout the night to tend the fire and make sure that everyone stayed warm. This segmented sleep allowed for the fire to be maintained, the shelter to be checked, and the cold to be kept at bay. It was a practical solution to the dangers of an unprotected night. While it might seem strange to us, this fragmented sleep was a vital adaptation to the demands of medieval life. People couldn't afford the luxury of a long, uninterrupted rest. They had to remain vigilant, ready to face whatever the night might bring. Scholars still debate the long-term effects of segmented sleep. Some argue that this pattern of interrupted sleep may have contributed to exhaustion and fatigue, making it harder for people to function. Others suggest that the body became accustomed to this pattern, adapting to shorter bursts of rest and learning to function on less sleep. But one thing is certain: the cold was a constant presence, and survival was a day-by-day, night-by-night struggle. Sleep, when it came, was never a guarantee. It was simply another part of the survival process, just like gathering firewood, protecting the shelter, and keeping the fire alive. As the morning light begins to strengthen, and the frost outside sparkles in the sunlight, you can't help but marvel at the endurance it takes to survive in the wilderness. The cold is relentless, but so is your will to live. You gather the firewood, stoke the flames, and feel a small sense of pride in your ability to keep the shelter intact, to survive another day. The cycle of survival continues. The fire will flicker, the cold will return, and the work will go on. But for now, in this moment, you have warmth, and that's enough. There's something deeply grounding in the simplicity of survival, the struggle for warmth, the effort to maintain the fire, the work required to gather resources. All of these tasks are part of a rhythm, a cycle that connects you to the land, to the seasons, and to the people who have come before you. This rhythm, this quiet determination to survive, is what has allowed people to live through the harshest of winters, to endure the cold and the isolation. It is a testament to human resilience, to the ability to adapt to even the most brutal of conditions. As the day goes on and the cold continues to press in, you find comfort in the knowledge that you are part of a long tradition of survival. The medieval people who lived through these winters didn't have modern technology, but they had something just as important: the will to keep going, the strength to endure, and the knowledge that every small effort, every task completed, brought them one step closer to another day of survival. And as you sit by the fire, preparing for the work ahead, you know that no matter how harsh the cold, you will continue to endure. You have made it through another night, and tomorrow you will rise again to face the next challenge. The cycle continues, but so does your resilience. The cycle continues, and the day begins again in its quiet, unrelenting rhythm. The warmth from the fire is fleeting, but for the moment, it is enough. The frost still clings to the earth outside, a thin veil of ice that glitters in the weak light of early morning. The cold, as ever, presses in, making every movement feel heavy, every breath a little more labored. Yet, the day's work calls, and you rise to meet it. There's no choice but to keep going. Survival isn't about ease, it's about persistence. As the fire burns low, you gather more logs, feeding the flames carefully, knowing it will be a constant task. The act of tending to the fire has become a ritual, a part of your daily existence. There's a comfort in it, in knowing that the warmth it provides, however temporary, is enough to keep the cold at bay for now. The fire is your constant companion, a reminder that despite the harshness of the world, there are small victories. You've made it through another night, and with each passing day, you come that much closer to spring, though spring feels like a distant dream, buried beneath layers of snow and ice. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people often faced winters that were far colder and longer than we can imagine today. The climate of the time, with its harsh, unyielding cold, made survival in the wilderness an even greater challenge. But despite the conditions, people found ways to make do. Their survival depended not just on physical strength, but on ingenuity, learning to work with the land, using the resources at hand, and maintaining a deep understanding of the environment. They knew how to hunt, fish, and gather food during the warmer months, but they also knew how to preserve it, how to make it last through the long, lean winter months. This resourcefulness, born of necessity, was key to surviving the harshest of winters. Yet, no matter how much effort went into preparing for winter, the cold was always a threat. Shelters, even those built with the best materials, were never fully insulated. The fire, though carefully maintained, could never provide enough warmth to make the shelter truly comfortable. But it was enough, just enough, to keep the cold from completely taking over. And that was the key. Survival wasn't about defeating the elements. It was about coexisting with them, adapting to their rhythms, learning to live in harmony with the land, despite its challenges. One of the more interesting aspects of medieval winter survival was the communal aspect of it all. People often lived in close quarters, not just for warmth, but because isolation in such conditions was dangerous. Living in a community allowed people to pool their resources, share their knowledge, and support each other during the harshest months. In a world where every moment felt like a battle against the elements, the community became a lifeline. Shared responsibilities, whether gathering firewood, cooking meals, or watching over the children, created a sense of solidarity, a quiet understanding that survival depended on each other. The cold could never fully be tamed, but the bonds forged in the struggle against it could be a source of strength. A quirky historical tidbit from the medieval era is that some communities would share shelter with animals during the coldest months. The proximity to animals, while seemingly strange by modern standards, was actually a practical survival strategy. The warmth of farm animals, especially large ones like cows or horses, could help keep the temperature inside the shelter a little warmer, even if only by a few degrees. People would huddle close to the animals, using their body heat to ward off the biting chill. The animals also provided essential resources like milk, meat, and wool, which were vital during the winter. It wasn't just about survival, it was about making use of every possible resource, no matter how unconventional it might seem. Historians still debate the exact nature of these communal living arrangements. Some believe that animals were often kept indoors for practical reasons, to protect them from the elements, while others suggest it was more about the emotional comfort of having the animals close by. In any case, it was a reminder that in the medieval wilderness, survival wasn't just about individual strength, it was about working together, using everything at your disposal to make it through the winter. Whether it was a neighbor's firewood, a shared meal, or the warmth of a family dog curled up at your feet, the community was a key to survival. As you sit by the fire, watching the embers flicker and fade, you reflect on the small victories that make survival possible. The cold is always there, creeping in from the edges, but the fire, the shelter, and the shared warmth of those around you are enough to keep it at bay for now. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that no matter how harsh the world becomes, you will find a way to adapt. You will find a way to keep going, to keep surviving. Each day is a step toward the next, each moment a testament to the resilience of those who came before. Scholars still argue whether medieval people fully understood how to cope with the mental and emotional toll of such harsh winters. Some suggest that the struggle for survival led to a kind of psychological resilience, while others argue that the constant isolation, fear, and discomfort caused significant mental strain. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. While people had to be tough to survive, the emotional weight of living in such conditions would have been immense. But somehow, people found ways to cope. They leaned on each other, on their routines, on the fire, and that, perhaps, is the greatest testament to their strength. As the night deepens and the cold presses in once again, you settle into the rhythm of survival. The fire burns low, but you know it will be enough to get you through the night. Tomorrow will bring more work, more struggle, more cold. But for now, in the warmth of the fire and the knowledge that you've survived another night, you find peace. The wilderness is harsh, but it is also a testament to your resilience. You will rise again tomorrow, ready to face whatever the cold may bring. The night stretches long as you lie in the shelter, the fire crackling in the corner, its faint warmth just enough to stave off the bite of the cold. The wind outside howls, its icy breath whispering through the cracks in the walls. But inside, there's a fragile sense of comfort. For now, you are warm enough. But the cold is always waiting, just beyond the firelight. It is a constant reminder that survival is never guaranteed. Every breath, every movement, is part of a delicate balance between warmth and freezing cold. As the fire dies down, you reach for more wood, feeding it carefully to keep the flames alive. There's no time for rest. Not yet. The cold can never be underestimated. It is relentless, creeping in when you least expect it, slipping through the smallest gaps, settling into your bones. You think of the past few days, the endless hours of work, the constant vigilance. The rhythm of survival has become so familiar that it's almost second nature now. The tasks that seemed so daunting at first, the gathering of firewood, the checking of the shelter, have become part of a daily routine, one that keeps you moving forward. A well-known historical fact is that medieval people relied heavily on their surroundings to survive the harsh winters. From the wood in the forests to the hides of the animals they hunted, everything was used. Resources were limited, and waste was a luxury no one could afford. People would often hunt and gather during the warmer months to preserve food for the winter, ensuring that they had enough to survive the long, lean months. But even with all the preparation, the winter was still a time of uncertainty. The cold was never fully predictable. Some years would be more brutal than others, and survival depended on how well people could manage the resources at their disposal. Historians still debate how much medieval people understood the severity of the winters they endured. Some suggest that they were intimately familiar with the rhythms of the seasons, knowing exactly when to gather firewood, when to hunt, and when to prepare for the coldest months. Others argue that the unpredictability of the weather could have caught even the most prepared off guard. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between. Medieval people were experts at adapting to the challenges they faced, but they were not immune to the surprises that nature could throw their way. A quirky little tidbit from history reveals that medieval people often used their immediate environment to craft simple, effective tools to help them survive. The materials they needed, wood, stone, bone, were often at their fingertips. They knew how to fashion basic tools for hunting, gathering, and even heating their homes. Some medieval homes had hearths built into the floor, designed to funnel heat from a central fire throughout the room. These designs, though rudimentary by today's standards, helped to create a more evenly distributed warmth in homes, making it easier to survive the cold nights. However, these innovations, while helpful, did not make the winters any less brutal. The cold was always there, a constant force that could never be fully controlled. Yet, despite the hardships, medieval people found ways to endure. They built shelters that could withstand the elements, made clothing from animal furs and wool, and adapted to the rhythms of nature. They relied on each other. Community and shared resources were vital for survival. No one could survive alone in such an environment. The bonds forged during these harsh winters were essential for emotional and physical endurance. As you sit by the fire, feeding it with fresh logs and adjusting your position to catch whatever warmth it offers, you reflect on the resilience of those who lived through these winters. The struggle for warmth was unrelenting, but they survived because they understood that survival was a collective effort. The same is true for you now. You rely on the fire, your shelter, and your own resilience to make it through each night. The cold may be a constant companion, but it is also a reminder of the strength you possess. Every task, no matter how small, is a testament to that strength. Scholars still debate the psychological toll of surviving such harsh conditions. Some argue that the isolation and constant danger led to a hardened, stoic people who found solace in the familiarity of their struggle. Others believe that the emotional toll of living through these long winters was far greater than we realize, leading to depression, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness. Either way, it's clear that the mental and emotional strain was just as great as the physical demands. You find yourself torn between the exhaustion of survival and the quiet peace that comes with simply surviving the night. But even as you lay there, with the fire burning low and the night stretching on, you can't help but acknowledge the quiet sense of accomplishment. You've made it through another night, and while the cold may return with the dawn, there's something undeniably comforting in the knowledge that you have persevered. Every night survived is a small victory, a step closer to the next day. And tomorrow will come, bringing with it more challenges, more cold, and more survival. But for now, you allow yourself a moment of peace, a brief respite before the cycle begins again. In the end, survival in the medieval wilderness was never just about the physical struggle. It was about the resilience to keep going, to find warmth in the cold, to share what little you had with others. It was about understanding that survival, no matter how difficult, was possible, as long as you kept moving forward. The cold will always be there, but so will your strength. The night will come again, but you will face it, as you always have, with the determination to survive. The wind outside howls like a distant, unseen force, rattling the walls of your shelter as the night deepens. The temperature has dropped again, and the cold seems to creep into every part of your body. Yet, there's a quiet steadiness in the way the fire crackles in the corner of your shelter, offering a brief moment of warmth. The embers glow, though faintly now, and you tend to the flames, carefully adding logs to keep them burning just a little longer. The heat from the fire is fleeting, but it is enough for the moment. As you settle back against the rough walls, pulling the furs tighter around you, you feel the weight of the night pressing in. The wilderness outside may seem still, but you know it's alive with sounds, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a twig as some creature moves in the distance, perhaps the haunting call of wolves. The darkness holds both danger and an eerie kind of peace. You have come to know these nights intimately, the cold and the quiet, the flicker of the fire and the strange comfort it offers. A well-established historical fact is that medieval people living in the wilderness would often spend much of the winter huddled indoors, doing whatever work could be managed by firelight. Life outside was a struggle. Hunting and foraging became increasingly difficult with the snow and frozen ground. Even if you did venture out, the cold would drain your energy, making every movement feel like a battle. Staying indoors, by the warmth of the fire, was the best option. But, as you know all too well, being confined to your shelter for days or weeks on end also brought its own challenges. There was the physical strain of constant cold, but also the mental fatigue, the isolation, the endless days without much change. The shared space within the shelter often became the center of all life during these months. Families, neighbors, and even strangers would huddle together, providing warmth, company, and a sense of connection. A core part of survival was maintaining these relationships. Everyone depended on each other, not just for firewood or food, but for emotional and mental support. The long, cold nights could feel crushing, but the company of others could make the weight of the world outside feel a little lighter. A quirky little tidbit about medieval communal living is that even in the most modest of homes, people would often sleep in close proximity. Sometimes, entire families, animals included, would sleep in the same room to maximize warmth. People weren't bothered by the close quarters because, in the face of such intense cold, the priority was warmth. The proximity to one another became a survival necessity, as much as it was a social custom. But this communal living wasn't just about warmth. It was also about shared life stories, chores, work, and sometimes a little laughter, all blended into the daily routine. The fire that crackled in the center was a focal point for not just heat, but conversation, companionship, and sometimes even a little bit of joy in a harsh world. Scholars still debate the emotional and social dynamics of these shared winter spaces. Was the closeness a comfort, or did it sometimes cause tension in the confined quarters? On one hand, the company of others could make the harsh conditions bearable. On the other, living so closely with others in a small, often smoky, dimly lit space could lead to frustration, especially after weeks or months of isolation. Whether the communal living brought people together or created a pressure cooker of emotion is still a subject of study. What is certain, however, is that during the worst of winters, these spaces of shared survival were vital for maintaining both physical and mental health. The winter months, with their long nights and dark days, could also offer moments of quiet introspection. When the fire was dying down, the shelter still, save for the occasional shifting of the logs, there was space for reflection. In a world that demanded constant labor, gathering wood, hunting, protecting the shelter, the moments of stillness became a time to reflect on life, on the passing of seasons, and on the survival of the self. There were no distractions, no modern technology to interrupt the silence. It was just you, the fire, and the night. In those moments it would be easy to feel alone, isolated. But the reality of medieval life was that no one was ever truly alone, not in spirit, not in need. Even when separated physically, people were connected through the struggle of survival. Medieval people understood that to endure the cold, to make it through another winter, you needed others. This interconnectedness was key to understanding how communities survived in such harsh conditions. The very act of surviving wasn't an individual feat, it was collective. Whether through shared resources, shared warmth, or shared labor, survival was always a team effort. Historians still argue about the level of cooperation required for survival. Were these communities more resilient because of their shared work, or did the hardships of the cold lead to more competition and conflict? Some suggest that the struggle to survive brought people closer together, while others believe it forced people to withdraw and become more insular. The question of social cohesion versus individual survival remains a point of discussion. Yet, there is one thing that is certain. Survival, in all its forms, was, and still is, an intensely communal experience. And as the fire burns low, the cold creeping back into your shelter, you realize that the survival cycle continues. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new struggles, but also new opportunities. The cycle of life and death, warmth and cold, is never ending. Every day brings you closer to surviving another season, another winter. The wilderness, as unforgiving as it is, becomes a teacher showing you not only the power of the cold, but the incredible strength it takes to endure it. The fire flickers, and the shelter settles into a quiet stillness. The night continues, and as you close your eyes, the harshness of the cold outside, the quiet hum of the wilderness, reminds you of how far you've come. You've made it through another night, and as the world outside remains frozen and silent, there is warmth in knowing you will rise to meet the next challenge. That's the essence of survival. Never giving up, never yielding to the cold, and always finding a way to endure. The morning comes with the same chill, the same struggle. The fire is little more than a handful of embers now, and the frost on the ground outside glistens under the faint light of the Sunday. It's not enough warmth to make the world feel any less cold, but there's something in the brightness of the morning light that feels like a promise another day to survive, another day to endure. You rise, stiff and sore, beneath the furs, the familiar ache of the cold in your bones. The first breath of the day is always the hardest, the air biting into your lungs, sharp and unforgiving. The wind still howls outside, making it impossible to forget that the wilderness is a force you can never fully tame, but you've learned to live with it. The cold is constant, but so are you. Survival isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And as you pull on your layers of wool and furs, you prepare yourself for another day in the struggle against the elements. A well-documented historical fact is that medieval people, especially those living in the wilderness, spent much of their time preparing for the next season. The cold winters could last for months, and surviving them required careful planning. From gathering firewood to storing food, the preparation began long before the first frost. But even with the best preparations, the harshness of the winter was never guaranteed to relent. A well-stocked shelter and a steady supply of firewood could offer comfort, but they couldn't stop the cold from creeping in. No matter how much they prepared, medieval people were always at the mercy of the elements. The rhythm of winter survival had a particular cadence: gather, stock, protect, survive. But even with all the careful preparations, the challenge of staying warm during the long, dark months remained. You could build the best shelter, gather the most firewood, and layer yourself in the finest furs, but the cold would still find a way to test you. It wasn't about conquering the cold, it was about learning to live with it, to make peace with it, to survive in spite of it. A quirky tidbit about medieval winter survival is that people would sometimes use their animals as more than just a source of warmth and food. In some areas, it wasn't uncommon for medieval people to use the warmth of their animals to help combat the bitter cold. Animals such as goats, sheep, and cows were often kept close to human living spaces during the coldest months, as their body heat provided an extra layer of warmth. This shared space between humans and animals wasn't just a survival tactic, it was also a necessity. Animals were integral to medieval life, providing everything from food and milk to warmth during the coldest nights. Historians still argue how common this practice was. Some suggest that rural people were more likely to house their animals indoors during the winter, while others claim that the practice was more widespread, even in the cities. What is certain is that the reliance on animals for warmth, food, and even emotional support played a significant role in medieval survival during the harsh winters. As you step outside to begin your daily tasks, the cold hits you all over again. Your breath forms clouds in the air, and the frost on the trees sparkles in the pale light. You can hear the crunch of snow beneath your boots, and the world around you is stark and still. The landscape seems frozen in time, a world of quiet isolation. Yet, in this stillness, there is a sense of purpose. Every movement, every task you perform brings you one step closer to survival. The cold is a constant, but so is the work. The firewood needs gathering, the shelter needs reinforcing, and the food needs to be prepared. A lesser-known aspect of medieval survival is how important routine was for mental and emotional health. When you live in a world defined by isolation and struggle, routine becomes a stabilizing force. The daily tasks, no matter how small or repetitive, are an anchor in a world where survival is never certain. The fire must be maintained. The wood must be chopped. The food must be preserved. Each task, though grueling, is a way of asserting control over your environment. And in that control, there's a sense of comfort, a quiet reassurance that you're doing what you can to survive. Scholars still debate how much the physical demands of winter affected the psychological well-being of medieval people. Some argue that the constant labor helped to distract from the mental strain, while others suggest that the isolation, combined with the exhausting work, could have led to stress, anxiety, and depression. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between. The mental toll of living through the cold, especially in isolation, cannot be underestimated. But it was the sense of community, the shared effort of surviving together, that helped people make it through. As the day moves forward, you work through the tasks with a kind of quiet determination. The cold is always there, but so is your strength. You gather firewood, check the shelter for weaknesses, and prepare the food. These simple tasks become your life. They keep you connected to the present moment, to the rhythm of survival. The cold may always be waiting at the edges, but the fire, the warmth of your companions, and the sense of purpose you derive from the work are enough to keep it at bay for now. The night will come again, with its familiar bite, its promise of another long stretch of cold and isolation. But tomorrow, there will be more work to do, more survival to be had. The cycle will continue. The cold will press in, but so will your resolve. In this quiet, harsh world, survival is about endurance, about withstanding the elements, the isolation, and the challenge of making it through another night. The fire, the warmth, the routines, they are what sustain you. And for now, that is enough. The night wraps around you like a heavy blanket, and the cold creeps in once more, making its presence felt even through the layers of furs and wool. The fire, now just a bed of glowing embers, offers only a dim light, barely enough to illuminate the dark corners of your shelter. Yet it provides a small comfort, a faint promise that warmth is still possible, even if fleeting. You stoke the embers carefully, adding a few more logs to the fire, and listen to the soft crackle as the flames begin to dance once again. The cold presses in, but for now, the fire holds it at bay. As you settle into your furs, trying to find a more comfortable position, the wind howls outside, a reminder that the wilderness doesn't rest. It seems as though the cold, in its many forms, is always present no matter how many layers you put on, no matter how well you prepare. It's always there, just beyond the shelter's fragile walls. The stillness of the night is broken only by the sound of the wind, the occasional crack of the fire, and your own breathing. Each inhale a reminder of the struggle to survive. A mainstream historical fact about medieval winters is that, even with all the preparation and survival strategies, people were still vulnerable to the worst of the elements. It wasn't just the cold itself that was dangerous. It was the effects the cold had on health. The constant exposure to freezing temperatures could lead to frostbite, illnesses, and weakened immune systems. People who lived in rural areas or in the wilderness often had limited access to medical care, meaning that the physical toll of the cold could be devastating. Even something as simple as a cold or a small injury could become life-threatening in such conditions. And yet, people endured. They learned to live with the cold, to adapt to it, and to survive. The cold wasn't just an external force, it was an enemy that worked on every part of your body. You could feel it in your limbs, in the stiffness of your joints, and in the slow drain of energy that came with every breath of cold air. Even with the warmth of the fire and the layers of clothing, the cold seemed to seep in through your bones. The rhythm of life became a balancing act between staying warm and staying alive. There was never enough warmth. The fire never burned hot enough. The shelter never kept out all the cold, and the woolen layers weren't enough to block the chill of the wind, but it was enough to keep going. That was the key to survival, not defeating the cold, but finding a way to make it through. One more night, one more day. A quirky tidbit from medieval history reveals that people sometimes wore iron, cold bands around their wrists and ankles during particularly cold months to stave off frostbite. These iron bands were believed to help regulate blood flow, keeping the extremities warm in the freezing temperatures. While there's no definitive evidence that these bands worked, the practice speaks to the lengths medieval people were willing to go to protect themselves from the cold. The cold wasn't something you could avoid, it was something you had to fight with every tool at your disposal. Scholars still debate whether medieval people were more attuned to the dangers of the cold than we are today. Some argue that, because they lived so closely with nature, they developed a stronger understanding of how to protect themselves from it. Others suggest that the harshness of the winters often left people at the mercy of the elements, with only limited means of protection. What is clear, however, is that medieval people lived in constant tension with the cold. They had to be aware of every change in temperature, every shift in the wind. A sudden drop in temperature could be disastrous, and a mild winter might lull people into a false sense of security. It was a constant balancing act between preparation and vigilance. Despite all the ways medieval people adapted to survive, the isolation and monotony of winter were just as difficult to endure. The cold wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one as well. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and the landscape outside remained frozen and unchanging. The stillness of winter could be as isolating as it was beautiful. You could be surrounded by others, huddled together for warmth, but still feel the weight of the cold, the weight of the isolation, and the weight of the long winter nights. And yet, it was the shared struggle that helped people endure. The fire, the shelter, the company, these were the things that made the cold bearable. The fire in the center of your shelter is more than just a source of warmth. It is a symbol of survival, a fragile light in the midst of the darkness and the cold. As the fire flickers, casting shadows on the walls, you are reminded that no matter how harsh the world outside, there is always something worth holding on to. You are not alone in this struggle. You share it with others, those around the fire, those in the shelter with you, those who lived through the same winters before. Survival is a shared effort, and even in the darkest nights, the fire reminds you that there is always hope. Historians often highlight how the simple act of tending to the fire was a form of self-care, a ritual that helped people mentally and emotionally cope with the difficulties of winter. The act of keeping the fire alive, watching the flames dance, and feeling the warmth on your face provided a sense of accomplishment, a brief moment of peace. Even in the worst conditions, the fire became a comforting presence, a small, flickering reminder that warmth was possible, even in the coldest of times. As the night stretches on and the fire slowly fades, You settle back, your body weary from the long day. The cold is pressing in again, but you know that tomorrow will bring the same tasks, the same struggles, the same efforts to survive. Yet, there is comfort in knowing you are doing everything you can to keep the cold at bay. The fire, the shelter, the shared warmth of those around you, they are enough to make it through one more night. And as you close your eyes, the sound of the wind outside becomes a lullaby of sorts, a reminder of the world beyond your shelter, the world that waits for you tomorrow. For now, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of survival are enough. You have made it through another night. The first light of morning seeps through the cracks in the shelter, pale and weak, just enough to tell you that another day has arrived. The cold, as it always does, has crept back in, but there is a quiet reassurance in the rhythm of survival. The fire is almost out now, just a faint glow of embers left to cling to. You sit up slowly, feeling the stiffness in your muscles as you stretch beneath the weight of the furs, the chill already beginning to settle into your limbs. You rise, your body aching from another night spent struggling to stay warm, and you move toward the fire, careful not to let the cold fully overtake you. The act of stoking the fire, feeding it with more wood, has become an automatic reflex. The fire is both lifeline and ritual, something you rely on to survive, but also something you've come to depend on emotionally. It's always there, flickering in the corner, the soft crackle of the flames offering the barest semblance of warmth. It is the symbol of hope in the cold, an anchor in a world that offers little respite. Without it, the shelter would be little more than a space surrounded by darkness and frozen earth. The fire is everything, the warmth, the light, the comfort. Even as it flickers low, you know that the fire, however fragile, is what keeps you going. A widely accepted fact about medieval winters is that fire was not just a source of warmth, but a source of survival. Medieval people lived in close proximity to fire at all times, whether in hearths, fire pits, or simple campfires, and it was an essential part of daily life. Beyond the basic necessity of heat, fire also provided light for working after dark, protection from wild animals, and a way to cook food. The relationship people had with fire was deep, almost spiritual. The constant tending to it, the need to keep it alive, became a part of the survival ritual. Without it, survival would have been far more difficult, if not impossible. However, even with the most carefully tended fire, the cold was an ever-present adversary. The shelters, no matter how expertly constructed, could not fully block the cold out. The materials used, wood, stone, earth, had their limits. They offered some insulation, but the winter would eventually seep in. People living in the wilderness had to learn to live with this reality, to accept the cold as a constant companion, and to adapt. The ability to withstand the cold was just as important as the fire itself. People built their bodies against the chill, layering themselves with animal skins, wool, and whatever else they could find. But these layers were never enough to protect fully. Every night was a gamble, every morning a victory. A quirky piece of medieval history is the use of straw mattresses, which were common in rural areas. Though uncomfortable, they were an essential part of staying warm during the long winter nights. The straw, while not soft, would insulate the body from the freezing earth beneath. Sometimes, people would stuff straw into the walls of their shelters as well, providing an additional layer of insulation. The use of these simple materials speaks to the ingenuity of medieval people, resourceful in making do with what they had, yet always fighting a battle against the cold. Despite their ingenuity, they were at the mercy of nature. Even with the straw mattress, the body would still grow cold as the night went on. Yet, as always, the fire and warmth from others provided just enough to make it through. Scholars still debate how medieval people psychologically dealt with such harsh living conditions. Some argue that the constant battle against the cold and the isolation led to a sense of communal strength, a shared understanding that survival was a collective effort. Others suggest that the isolation of the wilderness, particularly during winter, created significant mental strain. The long nights could be lonely and exhausting, and the uncertainty of the cold could lead to feelings of fear, helplessness, and even despair. No matter where the truth lies, what is certain is that survival was as much a mental battle as it was a physical one. In the stillness of the early morning, as you begin the familiar routine gathering wood, preparing food, checking the shelter, you are reminded of the mental and emotional strength required to endure these winters. The physical work is grueling, but it also gives a sense of purpose. Every task you complete, every fire you tend, is a small victory. It is through these routines that survival becomes possible. They ground you in the present, making you focus on the necessary steps to stay alive, to stay warm, to stay connected to the world around you, even if that world is cold and dark. A small but important part of medieval survival was the sharing of stories, and how those stories helped to keep people connected. Storytelling around the fire was more than entertainment. It was a means of maintaining a sense of community, of preserving knowledge, and of providing some distraction from the endless cold. The warmth of the fire and the company of others made the isolation more bearable, and the stories they shared became a thread that tied everyone together. It wasn't just about passing the time, it was about reinforcing the bonds that allowed people to survive in the harshest of circumstances. The psychological aspect of survival was just as crucial as the physical one. The need for connection, the comfort of others, the shared experience of struggling against the cold, these were the things that made the hardships a little more bearable. Though the cold might have been unyielding, the warmth of companionship, the light from the fire, and the shared task of survival offered a form of resistance. It wasn't just about fighting the elements, it was about finding strength in community, in shared purpose. As you sit by the fire, its warmth radiating toward you, you understand just how much survival in the wilderness depended on those around you. The task of enduring was never an individual one, it was shared, woven into the fabric of daily life. Even as the cold presses in, there is strength in knowing that you are part of something larger than yourself, part of a history of people who have lived through these challenges, who have found ways to endure, to adapt, and to survive. Tonight, as the cold creeps back in, you know that the fire will flicker, the shelter will provide its meager warmth, and the routines will continue. The struggle is far from over, but the resilience of those who lived through these winters, and of those who share this struggle with you, gives you the strength to carry on. Tomorrow will come, and with it, another day of survival, another cycle of enduring the cold. And yet, as you settle in, you know that it will be enough to face whatever comes next. The first faint light of dawn filters through the cracks in the shelter, and though the cold still presses in, there's something in the morning light that feels like a promise, a quiet assurance that you've made it through another night. The world outside is still blanketed in snow, the ground hard and frozen, but inside the shelter, you know there's work to be done. You stretch stiff limbs beneath the furs, feeling the ache of cold in your bones. But you rise, just as you have every day, knowing the cold is an obstacle that must be faced, no matter how overwhelming it may seem. The fire, though now a bed of smouldering embers, still offers a few moments of warmth. You stoke the fire, carefully feeding it with more wood, watching as the flames flicker to life once again. Each time the fire ignites, it feels like a small triumph. The cold will come back, you know, but for now, there is light, and there is warmth, however fleeting. The fire has become a symbol of your resilience, an anchor in the otherwise unyielding wilderness. A well-known historical fact is that the medieval people who survived the winters were incredibly resourceful. They had to be. The cold was a constant threat, and survival depended on not just the physical endurance to keep going, but the mental and emotional ability to adapt to a world where comfort was scarce. People who lived in the wilderness during this time were experts at making do. They used every part of the animals they hunted: skins for warmth, bones for tools, fat for cooking. Everything had a purpose, nothing was wasted. Even firewood had to be gathered carefully and conserved for the long months ahead. This adaptability, the ability to find value in everything around them, was key to surviving in such an unforgiving environment. Despite all this ingenuity, there were still moments of vulnerability. The cold was never fully beaten back. It was a constant presence. Medieval shelters, though constructed with care and using the best available materials, were never fully insulated. The elements always found a way to creep in. But people learned to live with the cold, to work around it, and to use the resources they had to stay warm enough to survive. It was a delicate balance, stoking the fire, layering the clothing, gathering enough firewood, and yet, in many ways, it was a dance with nature. They didn't conquer the cold. They simply learned how to endure it, how to live with it. A quirky little historical tidbit comes from the practice of smoke holes, a feature in some medieval homes that allowed smoke from the fire to escape. But beyond their practical use, these holes had an additional, almost mystical significance. It was believed that the smoke from the hearth had protective qualities, keeping away evil spirits and offering a kind of safety. The smoke itself became a part of daily life, a reminder of the dangers that surrounded people, but also a part of their defense against those dangers. It's interesting to think of how something so simple, so everyday, could carry such meaning in a world so steeped in uncertainty. Scholars still debate how much medieval people believed in these protective qualities of smoke and fire. Some suggest that it was more superstition than fact, while others argue that the rituals surrounding the fire were deeply ingrained in their way of life. Either way, what's clear is that the fire, whether it was for warmth, cooking, or protection, was central to the survival of medieval people. It wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, a force that connected them to both the physical world and to the spiritual one. In a way, the fire represented everything they had: warmth, life, and the will to survive. As the day begins to stretch on, you continue the familiar cycle. There's work to be done, gathering wood, checking the shelter, preparing food, and each task is a small victory in itself. The cold presses in, yes, but with each moment spent by the fire, you are reminded that survival isn't just about enduring the cold. It's about finding strength in the routine, in the work that sustains you. Every log added to the fire, every breath of warmth, is another step toward enduring another night. A common aspect of survival that historians note is the importance of communal living in medieval times. The winters were harsh, and isolation was dangerous. People didn't live alone, whether by necessity or by choice. They were part of a tight-knit community, all working toward the same goal: survival. The shared labor, shared warmth, and shared stories helped people endure the long nights. They knew that alone they wouldn't survive. But together, they could fight the cold, share resources, and make it through. As you gather firewood for the next cycle of warmth, the weight of community is clear. The knowledge that others are facing the same struggles, working toward the same goal, helps to lighten the burden. You may not speak much, but the presence of others, their shared effort, becomes part of the rhythm of survival. It's easy to forget, in the isolation of the wilderness, that you are not alone in this struggle. But in the quiet, communal moments around the fire, the connection to those around you is tangible. You survive together. Historians continue to debate whether these medieval communities truly formed bonds as strong as we imagine. Some suggest that the harsh winters led to greater solidarity, while others argue that the competition for resources often caused tension. What is clear is that the need for cooperation was undeniable. No one could endure the cold alone. Whether through shared work or shared warmth, the bonds formed during the winter months were essential for survival. As you sit by the fire, the familiar cycle of survival continues. The cold presses in, but for now, you are warm. The fire flickers low, but you know it will survive another night. Tomorrow will bring more challenges, more cold, but for now, there is peace in knowing you've made it through. You've survived another night, and in the wilderness, that's enough. The fire crackles softly as the last of the day's light fades from the sky, and the chill of the evening presses against the shelter. The cold is a familiar presence, always lingering just outside the warmth of the fire. You sit close to the embers, the glow casting long shadows across the walls. The tasks of the day are behind you: firewood gathered, shelter checked, food prepared, but the cold still gnaws at your bones. Every night feels like a test of endurance, and yet there is comfort in the rhythm of it all. The fire, however fragile, is a constant companion, and its warmth is a reminder that survival is possible, even in the harshest of conditions. As you sit by the fire, the dance of the flames mesmerizes you. It's strange how something so simple can become a lifeline, a connection to life itself. The crackling and popping of the fire, the soft warmth on your skin, offer a brief respite from the relentless cold. Yet, even as you watch the flames, you know it is fleeting. The fire will die down, and the cold will return. But that's the nature of survival in the wilderness. Nothing is ever permanent, and everything is fleeting. You make do with what you have, and for now, it's enough. A mainstream historical fact about medieval life in the wilderness is that people often had to rely on whatever natural materials they could find to survive. Animal furs, timber, and even mud were used to build shelters and keep out the cold. Medieval people did not have the luxury of modern insulation or advanced heating systems. Instead, they made use of the resources around them, crafting homes that could withstand the harshest conditions. The shelter, though often rudimentary by today's standards, was a crucial part of surviving the winter months. But, even with the best materials, medieval shelters were still vulnerable to the cold. The elements could always find a way in, and the struggle to stay warm was constant. Despite these challenges, medieval people were incredibly resourceful. They didn't have the convenience of modern tools, but they had ingenuity. They learned to adapt, to use what was available. The cold was never fully defeated, but it was managed. Layers of clothing, blankets, animal skins, and the fire itself were all part of the survival strategy. The key wasn't to conquer the cold, but to find ways to coexist with it, to adapt to its presence and live in spite of it. A quirky tidbit from medieval times reveals that people sometimes used their clothing as a form of insulation, layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur. People would wear multiple layers of clothing to keep warm, and even their socks, gloves, and boots were made from wool or fur. The idea was to trap body heat, to create as much insulation as possible against the cold. But the layers could also make movement difficult, especially when the snow was deep or the wind howled through the trees. Still, despite the discomfort, these layers helped medieval people survive the long winters. Every piece of clothing was essential, every layer a shield against the cold. Historians still debate how effective these layers were. Some suggest that the multiple layers of wool and fur were more effective than we realize, especially when combined with the body heat generated by shared living spaces. Others point out that while clothing was an important part of survival, it could only do so much. Even the warmest furs could not completely block out the bone-chilling cold. And yet, despite the limitations, these simple methods of insulation were enough to help medieval people endure. The fire, the shelter, and the clothing were all part of the delicate balance that allowed people to survive in such harsh conditions. But survival wasn't just about the physical needs, it was also about the mental and emotional strength required to face the cold, day after day. The isolation, the silence, and the endless cold could wear on a person, especially during the long, dark months. Yet, despite these challenges, medieval people found ways to cope. They shared stories, sang songs, and passed down knowledge from generation to generation. The hearth became a place of not just warmth, but of connection. Even when the world outside was bleak and unforgiving, the community provided a sense of continuity, a reminder that life went on, even in the darkest of times. As you sit there, the fire flickering in the silence of the night, you realize that survival is never about defeating the cold, it's about enduring it, adapting to it, and finding strength in the struggle. The cold will always be there, but so will you. The fire, the shelter, The shared moments of connection, they are the things that make survival possible. The cold presses in, but you stand firm, determined to face another day, another night. The world outside may be cold and unforgiving, but inside there is warmth, there is hope, and there is the knowledge that you can survive. Tomorrow will come, as it always does, bringing with it more challenges, more cold, and more work. But for now, in the quiet warmth of the fire, there is peace. You've made it through another night, and that, in the wilderness, is enough. The first light of dawn stretches thinly across the snow-covered landscape, faint but enough to dispel the darkness of the long, cold night. The cold is ever present, creeping in as the night fades, but there is an odd comfort in the quiet stillness of the morning. The fire, now reduced to a few glowing embers, still holds a faint trace of warmth. You reach for more wood, knowing that without this small victory, without the warmth of the fire, the day ahead would seem impossible. The ritual of tending to the fire is more than a task. It is a necessity, a connection to life itself. Without it, survival in this brutal wilderness would be a constant struggle. You rise slowly, feeling the familiar ache in your limbs from the cold that seeped in through the night. The frost on the shelter's walls glistens in the pale light of morning, and the world outside feels frozen in time. The snow crunches beneath your boots as you step out of the shelter, and the cold hits you like a wall, sharp and unyielding. Yet, there's something in the world's silence that feels strangely peaceful. The wilderness, vast and unrelenting, is a reminder of the fight ahead. But there is also beauty in it, a stark beauty that comes from the knowledge that survival, no matter how difficult, is possible. A historical fact often cited about medieval survival is that the ability to find food during the winter months was one of the greatest challenges faced by those living in the wilderness. Hunting, foraging, and fishing all became significantly more difficult when the ground froze and the trees lost their leaves. Medieval people were forced to rely on what they had preserved during the warmer months: dried meats, salted fish, root vegetables, and grains. These supplies, carefully stored and rationed, were vital to making it through the long winter. But even with careful preservation, food was always scarce. The cold made everything harder: gathering firewood, finding food, and staying warm. The act of hunting itself, during the winter months, was more than just about survival. It was about proving that you could overcome the elements. Tracking animals through snow-covered forests, waiting for hours in freezing temperatures, and using every tool available to capture prey required not only skill but an understanding of the land. Survival wasn't about brute force, it was about knowledge. You had to know the land, its rhythms, its patterns. You had to adapt to the seasons, anticipate the cold, and act accordingly. The hunt wasn't just for food, it was for the strength to endure, to rise again every day and face the cold, the darkness, and the isolation. Historians debate the mental toll of the constant struggle for food and warmth during these winters. Some suggest that the stress of hunting, gathering, and the constant vigilance against the cold led to long-term fatigue, both physically and mentally. Others argue that this lifestyle, though taxing, may have built mental resilience, a stoic endurance that allowed people to continue, no matter how harsh the conditions. There's no simple answer, but the fact remains that those who lived through these winters were undeniably resilient. They didn't just endure, they adapted, persevered, and, in many cases, thrived. A quirky tidbit about medieval survival is the use of hunting dogs, which were integral to hunting during the winter months. These dogs were not just companions, they were part of the strategy. Medieval people trained dogs to track game, to retrieve animals, and to help protect them from the dangers of the wilderness. The bond between humans and animals was crucial for survival. In some areas, dogs would even sleep inside the shelter for warmth, curled up against their owners in the coldest months. The companionship of the animals, the shared warmth, and the mutual dependence all contributed to the daily fight for survival. These animals were not pets, they were essential to living. The community's reliance on each other during the winter months was just as crucial as the tools and resources at hand. Families, friends, and neighbors worked together to survive, sharing food, firewood, and warmth. The cold made isolation dangerous, and the shared struggle created bonds of support that were necessary for mental well-being. Even in a world full of harshness and danger, the presence of others provided comfort. The warmth of the fire, the companionship of those around you, and the shared labor all made the unrelenting cold just a little more bearable. As you sit by the fire, the quiet hum of survival wraps around you. The cold presses in from all sides, but the fire, the shelter, and the people around you offer a shield. It is strange how, despite the cold, there is warmth in the shared struggle, in knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same, another battle against the cold, another day to survive. The ritual of survival is endless, a rhythm of work, warmth, and connection. And though the cold can never truly be conquered, there is something powerful in knowing that you've survived another night. Tomorrow, the cold will return. The fire will need tending, the shelter checked, the food rationed. But for now, the quiet warmth of the fire and the knowledge that you've made it through another day are enough. You may not be able to conquer the wilderness, but you can endure it. And that's what survival is about. Not defeating the elements, but finding the strength to live with them. The cold is always there, but so are you. The night settles in once again, and with it comes the familiar bite of the cold. The wind howls outside, making the walls of the shelter creak and groan. But inside, the fire flickers softly, casting a faint, dancing light across the room. The warmth, though brief, is a comfort. You huddle closer to the fire, the heat slowly seeping into your chilled bones. The cold outside is a constant, but the fire, though small, offers you a fleeting reprieve. The act of tending to the fire has become second nature, a routine you've settled into over the course of these long months. Each night is a quiet reminder that survival is never guaranteed, but that there is still warmth to be found, as long as you keep the fire alive. The cycle of gathering wood, feeding the flames, and huddling close to the warmth is one that has become as much a part of your life as the cold itself. It is a rhythm that carries you through the nights, the constant struggle against the elements softened by the glow of the fire. A historical fact, often noted by scholars, is that fire was the centerpiece of medieval homes, especially in the wilderness. A hearth wasn't just a source of heat, it was the focal point of daily life. People gathered around it to cook, to share stories, to sleep near its warmth. Even though firewood was a precious resource, it became the heart of the shelter, providing not just warmth but also a sense of security. In a world that was often cold, dark, and dangerous, the fire was a lifeline. It offered both physical comfort and emotional solace. It was the one thing that could always be relied upon to provide a measure of safety. Despite the importance of the fire, however, it was never a perfect solution. Even the best-built shelters, surrounded by firewood and insulated with animal skins, couldn't keep the cold at bay completely. The temperature would drop, the wind would howl, and the chill would always find a way to creep in. Medieval people knew this well. Their lives were a constant balance between warmth and cold, safety and danger. They learned to adapt, to make do with what they had. The fire could only do so much. The rest was up to them, their ingenuity, their resilience, and their ability to endure. As you sit by the fire, watching it crackle and shift in the dim light, you can't help but reflect on the fragility of it all. The fire, though central to your survival, is always at the mercy of the elements. A strong wind, a shortage of firewood, or an unexpected storm could easily extinguish it. The cold would return, pressing in from every side, reminding you that warmth is never permanent. Survival is never permanent. It's always about the next day, the next task, the next struggle. And yet, there's something powerful in the knowledge that, for now, you've won. The fire burns, the warmth is here, you've made it through another night. A quirky piece of medieval history tells us that some people would use their hearths not just for warmth and cooking, but also for other practical purposes. In some areas, it wasn't uncommon to see homes with multiple fires, or even portable hearths that could be moved around the house. This allowed people to have warmth where they needed it most, and it also helped to distribute heat more evenly. But perhaps the most unusual use of the fire was in creating what some have called fire beds, spaces near the hearth where people would sleep, huddled together, as close to the heat as possible. In many cases, entire families or communities would sleep around the hearth, using the fire to stay warm through the night. This wasn't just for comfort, it was a life-saving tactic. The cold was so unyielding that every bit of warmth was essential, and these fire beds were often the only thing standing between people and hypothermia. Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or just a localized tradition. Some suggest that it was common in areas where winters were particularly harsh, while others believe it was more of an exception. What is clear, however, is that the fire was central to medieval life, a constant, necessary force that shaped how people lived, worked, and survived. As you sit in front of your own fire, the crackle and warmth offering brief relief, you realize how much survival in the wilderness depends on the small victories. The fire may not be a permanent solution, but it's enough to get through the night. It's enough to give you the energy to face another day, to keep moving forward. Survival in the cold, whether in the medieval wilderness or in the modern world, is never about perfection. It's about adaptation. It's about finding ways to keep going, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Tomorrow will bring more work, more cold, and more uncertainty. But for now, as the fire burns low and the warmth begins to fade, you are reminded of the resilience of those who lived through these winters. They didn't have modern tools, modern comforts, or the safety nets we take for granted. What they had was ingenuity, endurance, and the simple determination to survive another day. And as you huddle closer to the warmth of your own fire, you find yourself connected to them. You are a part of that history, part of the cycle of survival that has kept people alive through the coldest, harshest winters. The cold will press in again, the fire will fade, but for now, you are warm, and that is enough. The night stretches on, and the cold continues its steady assault against the shelter. The wind howls, pressing against the walls like an invisible force, but inside, the fire continues to burn, though its warmth is already fading. You know that the cold will soon creep back in, as it always does. Yet for now, there is a quiet sense of victory in having survived another night. The fire crackles gently in the corner, and for a moment, everything feels just a little more bearable. As you sit near the warmth, wrapped in layers of clothing and furs, you find yourself reflecting on the days and nights that have passed. Each one has been a cycle of survival, gathering wood, tending the fire, checking the shelter, and maintaining the daily rituals that are the foundation of life in such a harsh world. The cold is never far away, but each small effort, each action taken to fight back against it, is a victory. It may seem like a constant battle, but it is the rhythm of survival. And as each day blends into the next, there's something comforting in knowing that you are part of this age-old cycle, one that has been endured by people for generations. The cold outside is harsh, but inside, there is warmth. The fire, though low now, still offers the hope of more warmth if you tend it well. You gather a few more logs, carefully feeding them to the flames. The fire flickers back to life, the warmth spreading slowly. It isn't much, but it is enough for now. The fire offers not just heat, but a sense of reassurance, a reminder that no matter how harsh the wilderness is, there are still things you can control, things you can fight for. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval period was defined by a constant battle against the elements. The winter months, especially in northern regions, were long and brutal, and survival during this time required not just physical strength, but mental resilience. People had to find ways to make their homes as insulated as possible, using animal skins, wool, and straw to line the walls and roofs. These efforts, while crucial, were never foolproof. The cold still managed to creep in. But despite these challenges, people found ways to make it through. They adapted, they learned, they relied on each other. And in doing so, they built a resilience that carried them through even the harshest winters. Scholars still debate the extent to which medieval people were aware of the dangers of the cold. Were they as prepared as we assume? Did they understand the risks associated with frostbite, hypothermia, or the slow toll that prolonged exposure to the cold could take on the body? Some argue that people were more attuned to these dangers, living close to nature and deeply in tune with the seasonal changes. Others suggest that the cold, while always a threat, was simply part of life, and that survival strategies were more reactive than proactive. Regardless of the degree of awareness, one thing is clear: the cold was a constant presence, and those who survived it were incredibly resourceful. One of the more surprising practices from the medieval period involved the use of warm stones, which were placed inside the shelter to help maintain warmth through the night. Large stones, heated by the fire, would be brought into the home and placed near where people slept. These stones retained heat for hours, offering a slow, lasting warmth that helped stave off the worst of the night's cold. While rudimentary by modern standards, these methods demonstrate the ingenuity of medieval people in using what they had at hand. They were not without their resources, and though the cold never fully gave way, these practices helped to make the harshness of winter a bit more bearable. As you settle in for the night, the warmth from the fire envelops you, and the cold outside, though ever present, seems more distant. The rituals of survival, the tending of the fire, the gathering of wood, the sharing of warmth become comforting in their repetition. They are a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life goes on. And though the wilderness may never truly be tamed, there is solace in knowing that you have found a way to live within it, to endure. The cold will return, as it always does. The fire will flicker, the shelter will creak, and the night will stretch on. But for now, in this quiet moment, there is peace. You've made it through another night. The warmth, the fire, the routines. These are the things that keep you going. Tomorrow will bring more challenges, but for now, you rest. You rest, knowing that you have endured, and that tomorrow you will rise again to face the cold. Survival is never easy, but in the harshness of the wilderness, there is a quiet beauty in knowing that you are part of this cycle, this rhythm of life that has endured for generations. And as the fire burns low and the world outside remains frozen and still, you close your eyes, ready to face another day. Sweet dreams.